Jury's present.
Please be seated. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And while you're getting your notes together, I'm going to ask you my questions. If your answer is yes to any of the questions, please raise your hand. During the lunch recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? No hands are being raised. And finally, did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case? No hands are being raised. Thank you. Mr. O'Mara, call your next witness, please.
The defense would call Doris Singleton, Your Honor.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ma'am. How are you?
I'm sorry?
I said, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank you.
And I guess you were just sworn back in, but you've testified here before the jury before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So let me focus you after you had a conversation where you took an initial statement from Mr. Zimmerman. We talked about that in your initial testimony, correct?
We did.
And then you were also present with Chief Investigator Serino when he was doing some of his workup, including a second statement taken from my client. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. I was there.
Okay. Was there a time that you were present where Investigator Serino was meeting with Tracy Martin?
Yes, I was there when he was meeting with Tracy Martin.
If you would, tell the jury the circumstances surrounding that.
Your Honor, I'm going to object this calls for hearsay, and we can approach the bench for
Yes, you may approach.
Singleton, we were at the point, I think, where you were telling us about an event with Officer Serino and Tracy Martin. Remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. I think the last question was, can you tell us sort of the setting, sort of give us an outlay of how things were when you were there?
Okay, I believe it was 2 days after the incident that Trayvon was shot, and Tracy Martin was there to speak to Chris Serino, and he was concerned that arrest hadn't been made, and Chris Serino was trying to explain to him the circumstances of the way.
Hearsay.
Your Honor, I would not be offering Officer Serino's statements as, for the truth of the matter, sort of rather laying out the foundation. I think that's an exception to the hearsay rule. I'm not going to get into what I'm speaking, and I apologize.
Okay. She could testify as to what she has observed and what the circumstances were, but not as to what anybody said.
You're approved,
Not as to what anybody said?
including the other officer? Because if then I would need to be heard at the bench for that, Your Honor. I know the limitation we talked about already, just not that one.
Well, go ahead and ask your question. I'll wait for an objection.
Okay, thank you. I think you were saying then sort of the setting, so if you would continue.
Okay, the setting was in the office cubicles at one, and it was sitting. They were both sitting at Chris Serino's desk. Chris in his own seat in an extra chair that had brought over to Chris's desk so that Tracy Martin could sit. I believe it was his girlfriend that was with him, and they were there to so that Chris Serino could explain to them why, at this point, an arrest couldn't be made.
And it was your understanding that Investigator Serino was still in the beginning stages of the investigation, is that correct?
Yes, I believe it was either 2 or 3 days after the incident.
And where were you sitting or standing while this conversation was occurring?
I was sitting probably diagonal to the cubicles. The cubicles are set in a square, and there's a path between them that you can walk through, and then there's a hall. And I was basically in the hall. It's not really a hall, but it's where the cubicles would end before there's another wall that actually has offices that are walled. So I was probably about 8 or 10 feet from his desk.
Okay. And did there come a time then that Investigator Serino played what we now know to be the Lauer 911 call for Mr. Tracy Martin and his girlfriend to listen to?
Yes, he played it for them.
And do you recall if it was played once or more than once?
I recall it was played once. I'm not sure if it was played more than that.
And without telling us the verbal response, what did Mr. Martin do in response to listening to the call?
Stand objection, Your Honor. Calls for
Well,
hearsay.
she could describe what she saw, but not what she heard.
You understand hearsay, right? And what you can and can't say. So I'm not asking you to tell us what Mr. Martin said, but I am asking you to give an observation as to his physical response.
He was very upset. He was very sad. He hung his head. He cried.
And did he give a response to Officer Serino?
Yes.
The next question, I think, might be objectionable for record purposes, Your Honor. What did Mr. Martin say in response to the question by Mr. Serino as to whether or not that was his son's voice?
Stand objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
And no further questions for this witness right now, Your Honor, though the state may have some.
No questions?
Okay, thank you. May Officer Singleton be excused? May Officer Singleton be excused?
I will need her to be recalled potentially as we go through the next couple
Okay.
of witnesses. Your
You're
Honor.
subject to being recalled, so please stay in the building. You're excused from the courtroom. Call
Yes,
your
ma'am.
next witness, please.
We call Chris Serino, Your Honor. Officer Chris Serino. in the building, Your Honor. I believe he's on the floor. We approach him, Your Honor?
Yes, you may. Okay, Officer Sereno, can we get him in court, please?
Would you raise your right hand? You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Of course, you testified here before the jury before today, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're placed back under oath, so your testimony will be as well, testimony under oath. We had begun a conversation with your last testimony that talked about the ongoing investigation that you were in charge of regarding this case. You were the chief investigating officer, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did there come a time that you met with Tracy Martin and his girlfriend, Brandy Green, in your office?
Yes, sir, there was.
Do you recall about how many days after the event of the shooting that was?
It was either the day after or the day after the walkthrough. I think it was on the 28th.
Okay. What was the purpose of you bringing Mr. Martin and Miss Green to your office?
To bring him up to speed as far as the progress of the investigation and where we were at that point.
Okay. They had some concerns, did they not, as to whether or not Mrs. Zimmerman at that point had been arrested?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And were you sharing with them your progress and what was done and what still needed to be done?
Yes, sir.
And can you outline the setting, where you were when you had this conversation with the two of them?
We conducted a meeting in the conference room that we have in the police department on the second floor. And and after that, I went ahead and played the 911 recordings for him.
Okay, do you recall where that recording, playing of that recording took place?
It was at my desk.
Okay. And that was, as testified to by a previous officer, sort of a cubby hole set up with 2 or 3 other desks in the close proximity?
Yes, sir.
And can you then tell the jury how that was set up, where you were sitting, where Mr. Martin was sitting if he was, and where Miss Green was sitting?
Okay, I was seated in front of my desk facing my computer monitor. Mr. Martin was to my rear left, and next to him was his girlfriend or fiance, Brandy, and kind of like in that posture.
Okay. So if I'm sitting at my screen right here, you were sitting down?
Yes, sir.
Tracy Martin then was just over your left shoulder?
Yes, sir.
And then Brandy Green just behind or next to him?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And what was the focus at that point?
The audio portions of the recording that was playing on my computer.
Okay. We know, and I want to focus you on what we have shorthand called the Lauer 911 call. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yes, sir.
And that is the call that has the screams on it and the gunshot?
Yes, sir.
And did you play that for Mr. Martin and Miss Green?
Yes, sir. I played all the recordings for him.
Okay. Focusing on the 911 call, we just talked about the Lauer 911 call. Tell me how you played that, what volume, or how the setting of that occurred.
I can't recall the number as far as the volume went, but it was audible, relatively clear, as clear as I had. It was played off of I believe off of a CD. It might have been digital or an email. Don't quite remember, but it was played, and it was audible.
Okay. And what was Mr. Martin's response?
Emotional, understandably so, and I let him listen first.
I'm sorry?
I let him listen first before I asked anything.
Okay. And what did you ask him?
I believe my words were, is that your son's voice in the background? Or something. I think I said a little differently than that, but I inquired as if that was, in fact, his son yelling for help.
And what was his response?
It was more of a verbal and nonverbal. He looked away and under his breath, as I interpreted, said no.
Did he ever ask that the tape be played for him again that time?
I don't believe so.
Did he ever evidence to you any concern with being able to hear the tape?
No, sir.
Had that occurred, would you have simply played the tape for him a second time?
Absolutely, sir.
And Ms. Green, what was her response?
She was consoling him. I didn't hear a response from her.
Did you ask her specifically whether or not she believed it to be Trayvon Martin's voice?
No, sir, I did not.
Did she offer any opinion voluntarily as to whether or not she believed it was Trayvon Martin's voice?
None that I recall, no, sir.
Do you know who else was present in the area sort of nearby, within, let's say, earshot of the playing of the call?
One of our sergeants was behind us. He was walking through. I guess he saw what I was doing, and he took it upon himself to stop, and I believe that was the only person that I saw.
Do you recall what that sergeant's name was?
Sergeant Leon Ciesla.
Nothing further on.
Thank you, Cross.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Let's talk about the last thing you mentioned. Sergeant Ciesla was walking by, or you believe stopped, is that correct?
Yeah, I know he stopped, yes.
Okay, and Detective or Investigator Singleton wasn't around as best you can recall, is that correct?
No, sir.
She was not, correct?
No, I didn't see her there.
Okay. Now, I assume by the nature of your profession that this is one of the most difficult things you have to do,
By far, sir. Yes, it is.
to have to talk about the death of a loved one to a parent.
Yes, sir, it was.
Is there anything more difficult that you have to deal with as an investigator in a case involving the death of a person?
Other than an initial notification, probably not.
And I gather you try to, as best you can, to be as sensitive as you can, realizing how sensitive this issue is, or how traumatic an event it can be, correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you attempt to do that as best you could?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. I gather you informed Trayvon Martin's dad that you were going to have him listen to some recordings?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you tell him ahead of time that there would actually be a shot? In other words, that he would actually listen to the death of his son? In other words, did you tell him ahead of time?
I don't recall specifically informing him of that, no.
Okay. But you played, I think you said 5 or 6 911 calls, is that correct?
Every one that I had, yes, sir.
Okay. And at this time, do you recall the order or how you played them, other than you played them all?
I don't recall the order, but yes, I played them all.
And would you agree that some of those recordings, such as Ms. Serdika's, was gut-wrenching, in other words, for a parent to have to listen to when they're talking about the death of their son?
Yes, sir.
Okay, they were pretty emotional.
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that Mr. Martin's reaction was appropriate in the sense of having to relive that, even though he wasn't there, but having to, again, understand that his son was no longer among us? In other words, that his son was dead in heaven, hopefully.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and would you agree that he reacted appropriately to that?
Yes, sir.
So you played the recording in which Ms. Serdika is, and the jury's listened to him, so I'm not going to play it again, but she's describing the death of this kid, or describing what she heard, whatever it was. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then you're playing other recordings in which other people are describing what they saw, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather as you're playing this, Mr. Martin's getting very emotional. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Was he having a hard time dealing with this?
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he didn't say, hey, hold on, this is too difficult for me. Let me come back another day. He went ahead and said, I'm going to listen to everything, because he wanted to know what was going on in the case. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And from your perspective, that was very understandable, correct?
Absolutely, yes,
I
sir.
mean, his son has been killed, 2 days earlier, correct?
Sir, yes.
And he's wanting some answers, as any parent should want. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yes, sir.
Wasn't that reasonable on his part?
Yes, sir, it was.
That next thing he knows, he gets home and his son's is missing, and then he realizes his son's dead.
Yes, sir.
And it's not just from natural causes. Somebody has shot him in the chest.
Let me object, Your Honor, outside the scope of direct examination.
I don't know, I think this is pertinent to the issue that I'm trying to establish, the scenario that Mr.
Well, then get
Martin.
to your next question, please.
Yes. In other words, did you preface any of this? I know this is going to be very difficult for you, but please try to listen to all these recordings. I'm assuming you did that because you're a police officer's been around the block a lot of times.
I believe I did, yes, sir.
Okay. And he, even though realizing it was going to be emotional, said, I'll try to listen through this and try to go through it.
Yes, sir, he did.
Okay. And as he's listening through this, is the emotion kind of building up? Do you see that building up?
It was a very emotional moment, yes, sir.
And then you played, at some point, the recording of the screams for help,
Yes, sir, I
correct?
did, yes.
But also in that recording, there's actually a gunshot, correct?
Yes, there is.
Okay. And I gather you played, as a good investigator, you played all the recordings from beginning to end, correct?
Yes, sir.
So that there would be no issue about what was going on, that you actually were thorough in your attempting to tell Mr. Martin what had happened.
My objective was to share all the information I had with him.
Okay. So you were providing all those recordings.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I gather he's listening to these cries and then he hears the gunshot, correct? And then
Yes,
you
sir.
keep playing it, right?
Yes, sir.
And I guess it was obvious in the way you were playing it that we were talking about his son having been shot.
Correct.
I mean,
yes, sir.
was there any dispute about that?
No, sir, there was not.
That he understood that that was the death of his son?
Yes, sir.
And I gather you being as sensitive as you can based on these circumstances. Well, I'm assuming it was emotional for you too.
It was trying for me, yes, it was.
Okay. And obviously being a good investigator, police officer, having done this for a long time, you were trying to be as sensitive as you could in dealing with the death of a young boy that the father was there, in other words.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then at some point you had to ask him some questions about the identification of the voice, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you, as best as you could, even though you knew Mr. Martin was upset and emotional, that you still felt you had a need to ask him at that point, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And I think you asked him something to the effect that you recognized the voice. Or do I have it right, or am I misstating what you said?
It was either do you recognize the voice or is that your son's voice in the background?
Okay. And as this was going on, when you specifically asked him that, I think you described Mr. Martin that his head was down, correct?
It was more like looking away from me and the computer.
Like he didn't even want to deal with it. Is
Yes,
that how
sir.
you interpreted it?
Yes, sir.
And then you stated that it was under his breath, I gather, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
And you interpreted it as he said no, correct?
Yes, sir.
I mean, you didn't flat out hear the word no unequivocally, or did you hear it like something under his breath and he was distraught?
I heard it and saw the movement of his mouth.
Okay, so you believe, your opinion is that he said no?
Yes, sir, it
Okay.
is.
Now, do you know if that no was directed to the fact that you had just played, literally, not a videotape of his son's death, but an audio tape, or was it related to the identification of the voice? Do you know?
Let me object, Your Honor, that would be speculation of this witness.
Sustained.
Would you agree that when you asked him that, that was after you had played the recording in which you were asking him to identify the voice, but in that same recording, he was hearing for the first time, right, the death of his son,
Yes, sir.
right? As
Yes.
far as you know, he had never heard this shooting before in terms of his son being killed.
Yes, this was prior before it was released, so it had to have been the first time.
Okay. If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes, you may.
And sir, I gather in all your years of doing this, when people are hearing about the death of a loved one. Even when you go like to the door, when you go to their house or something, most people, they react like, oh no, like, my God, something's happened. Their son or loved one is no longer among that. Is that a normal thing that people, or do people just react, oh, okay, no big deal?
It's extreme grief, so yes, that is typical.
And the word no is like, I can't believe it, like he's dead. Isn't that a normal thing?
That would be speculation.
It's based upon what his experience has been, so in that regard, I'll allow it.
Right? It's normal for, when you're telling them about the death of a loved one, people say, no, I can't believe it, that kind of stuff.
It could be construed as denial.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Like, that would be a normal thing based on your experience when people say no, correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Think you redirect?
Yes, please. When you talked about doing all of the 911 calls, you played all those 911 calls, correct? But
Yes, sir.
it was only after, and specifically after you played the Lauer 911 call, that you looked at Mr. Martin and asked if that was the voice of his son screaming in the background, correct?
It was the most graphic, yes, sir.
Right. And it was right at that precise time because you wanted to know what he thought of the voice on the tape, didn't you?
Objection, leading question.
What was the purpose of asking him?
To clarify that it was, in fact, if it was or if it wasn't his son's voice.
Right, because that was significant to your investigation, correct?
Yes, sir. it
You were
was.
doing it, as Mr. De Leon said, as sensitively as you could, but it was something you had to do as the chief investigator.
Yes, sir.
Because you knew that if Trayvon Martin's father had said
Objection
it,
is
what
the leading question.
Okay, you need to rephrase your question.
was it significant in your investigation that Mr. Martin said it was not the the voice of his son?
It became significant in the investigation because at that point in time, there really wasn't much of a dispute at that time of where that voice came from.
Because it was your understanding in your investigation that other information, well, let me ask you this. What other information supported that was George Zimmerman screaming?
Objection is to hearsay now.
Only to the extent that he was the chief investigating officer, Your Honor, and he...
No speaking objections,
Sorry.
please. Overruled.
It was statements that I obtained from the initial responding officers, coupled with statements provided by an eyewitness. You want names or?
Sure.
Okay, Officer Tim Smith, statements that he had heard the defendant make, and John Good, who at that point had provided me with the statement, both in writing and I believe taped also, that it was his belief that it was George Zimmerman the one yelling for help.
So, with that information in mind, you were presenting this to Mr. Martin with what idea? What did you want to accomplish by presenting this to Mr. Martin and having him listen to it?
For my own clarification, to make sure that everybody had it correct, or at that point, information that I had was correct.
And did Mr. Martin's response fit into the other information you already had available?
At that point in time, yes, sir, it did.
And to the extent that he said no, you understood that to be what? When he said no, what question do you think he was answering?
That the voice in the background was not that of his son's.
Did he ever contact you in the days or weeks after that to ask you whether or not he could listen to the tape again?
No, sir, he did not.
Did he ever say anything to you about, I want to change my mind and I want to listen to it again to see anything else about that tape?
No, sir.
Did you question directly Ms. Green in regard to her thought as to whose voice that was?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did she counter or contest Tracy Martin's acknowledgement that it was not his son's voice?
Objection calls for hearsay and also an assumption on the part of Ms. Green.
I'll rephrase it.
That the objection sustained.
Did Ms. Green counter, did she say anything that evidenced to you as the investigator that she disagreed with Mr. Martin?
No, sir.
Though it was undoubtedly a very emotional time for Mr. Martin and also for you. Do you have any concern that he understood your question and that he answered it by saying no?
No, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You were asked about information you had prior to that,
Yes, sir.
and you mentioned Mr. Good, correct? You
Yes, sir.
mentioned Mr. Good and you mentioned the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, correct?
I didn't mention Mr. Zimmerman. That was independent of Mr. Zimmerman.
Okay, you mentioned Tim Smith,
Yes, sir.
that he had actually heard the call, or he just said, this is what Mr. Zimmerman said?
Yes.
Okay, right?
Yes, based on what Mr. Zimmerman said to Officer Smith.
Right, and you recall when you played that recording to Mr. Zimmerman, that Mr. Zimmerman said, it doesn't sound like me. You recall that?
Yes, I did.
In terms of you played that 911 call and he told you, it doesn't sound like me, correct?
I believe his words were, that doesn't even sound like me, quote unquote.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And finally, sir, you were asked about Miss Green, who you knew as the fiancee or girlfriend of Mr. Martin, right?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that she was consoling Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in terms of what she said, she heard or not, she was focusing on providing whatever comfort she could
Yes,
to
sir.
the father of the father of Trayvon Martin.
Yes, sir.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, I gather in all your experience, you've never had a recording such as this where you don't just have a voice, but you also have the shooting itself all in one recording, or have you had that before?
No, this is the first.
That's the first time?
Yes, sir.
So it was pretty emotionally draining for you two, I'm assuming, having to play that for the victim's dad.
That and the circumstances surrounding the entire incident. Yes, sir.
There's not really a SOP or any kind of written directive in the police logbook or whatever, or case book on how to deal with things like this, is there?
Other than calling for spiritual assistance and support, but at that point in time, that interview or that debriefing or that briefing of the family, there is no that I'm aware of.
And I gather in the reaction of Mr. Martin, you kind of sensed what he was going through too.
Oh, yes, sir.
Was it obvious?
Very much so.
Thank you, sir.
Redirect?
Only on the one issue that was just brought up. When Mr. Zimmerman said to you in the challenge interview that you had with him, doesn't even sound like me, remember that, just brought up by Mr. Del Rionda?
Yes, sir.
You did not take that as an indication that Mr. Zimmerman was denying that it was him on the voice, did
Objection,
you?
leading question.
Sustained.
Did you, when Mr. Zimmerman said that to you, what indication did that give to you?
As typical as somebody hearing their voice on recording, a lot of people they don't recognize their own voices. It's a little bit different hearing it than how it sounds when you're speaking it.
Within the context of your investigation, did you accept that to be a denial by Mr. Zimmerman that it was actually his voice?
No,
Or
sir.
just that he didn't recognize his own voice?
I didn't take it as a denial, and I took it as him not recognizing his own voice.
Okay. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. May Officer Serino be excused?
At this time, subject to recall.
Okay, you're excused, but subject to being recalled. Thank you, sir. Call your next witness, please.
Recall Doris Singleton.
Officer Singleton, I'll remind you that you're still under oath. Please come up and have a seat. You may inquire.
Okay, good afternoon, officer. We had left you after you had set the setting for Officer Serino and Mr. Martin and Ms. Green getting ready to listen to the 911 call, the louder 911 call. You remember that testimony?
Yes, I remember.
And again, just tell us about how far away you were from that event.
Closer than I am to his desk right now.
I think you said on earlier testimony about 8 or 10 feet.
I believe it's 8 or 10
Let
feet.
me, if I might approach the witness, if I ask her to stop me at about the distance.
Hey, about right there.
Okay, so you're sitting there, and then
That's-
Officer Sereno's desk would be about here?
That's where they're sitting, yes.
Okay. You weren't actually part of the conversation, though, were you?
No.
You sort of observing it from afar or from 10 feet away?
Yes, I didn't feel like I should be too close to him. He needed his space.
Okay. But you were listening?
Yes.
And do you recall what it was that you heard Officer Sereno ask Mr. Martin after playing the loud 911 call?
If he recognized the voice.
Okay. Again, do you have the exact words, or you remember?
I don't know if those were exact words, but that was the question, if he had recognized the voice.
Okay. And Mr. Martin's response?
Was that it was not his son.
I think earlier you said that he actually put his head down or something.
Yes, and he was crying, and he was sad. He had his head down, and he was wiping his face with tissues. His girlfriend was behind him, trying to comfort him. She was kind of rubbing his shoulder some.
Did that, presuming that that was Brandy Green,
I believe that's who it was.
Okay. Did she say anything about whose voice she thought it was on the tape?
I don't recall hearing her say anything.
But again, Mr. Martin's words were
That was not his son's voice.
nothing further on.
Cross.
Good afternoon again, Officer Singleton. You recall actually Tracy Martin saying that was not his voice, that it's not his son's voice?
Yes.
Okay. And you clearly heard him say those words?
I don't know his exact words, but he was telling us that it was not his, or he was telling Chris that it was not his son's voice that was screaming for help.
I mean, he said words, in other words, like you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And then after that, he put his head down, is what you're saying?
I think it was even while listening to it
Okay.
that he was already crying, because you could hear the gunshot.
And so, obviously, you were sensitive of that too, the fact that they were playing this recording to the father of the person that's being shot on the tape, correct?
Yes, I was choked up myself. I had to stand back, and I felt, I could feel how he must feel, because I have children, and I was choked up by it, and I felt horrible for him.
And you could see that and sense that in Mr. Martin?
Yes.
Okay. And now, were you there for the playing of all the recordings, or just part of it?
I don't know if there was more recordings. That really stuck out in my mind, because I remember feeling so awful for him that he would have to hear that.
So as far as you can recall, the only one you recall is the one where they were playing the recording of the screams, but also the shooting of
Yes.
Mr. Martin's son.
Yes, and that's why it stood out in my mind.
And what stood out in your mind is the pain that father must have been going through at the time.
Yes, to know that he was hearing the sound that ended his son's life was tough to watch.
And did he, in your opinion, react as any grieving father would react?
Yes, he was very sad.
Now, he didn't get up and start screaming or anything, correct? He just basically put his head down and just started crying, right?
He was, I could see him wiping tears from his eyes. And, I mean, he didn't lose it. I'm sure he was trying to hold himself together, and he's in the middle of a police department. But you could see that he was upset, of course.
And as you indicated, even while you were doing it, even from a distance away, it was hard for you to listen to that, correct?
Yes, and I had already heard it.
And I think you've already stated you felt awful for him, correct?
I can't imagine having to go through that, because I have children, and I couldn't imagine.
Thank you, man.
Redirect.
As sad as it was, both for you to listen to and obviously for Mr. Martin to go through. Is there any doubt in your mind that he had said that that was not his son's voice that he heard screaming?
No, there's no doubt that he was telling us that that didn't sound like his son to him.
Thank you. Nothing further. Your Honor.
May Officer Singleton be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Subject to recall.
You're excused, subject to being recalled? Today? No. We'll call you. Thank you. Call your next witness, please.
Defense would call Adam Pollock.
Yes, you may.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir. State your name, please,
Adam Pollock.
and your occupation.
I own a gym and I'm a trainer.
Okay. Tell me how long you've been involved in, when you say owning a gym, how long have you owned a gym?
I've owned my gym right now for over 14 years.
And what's the name of it?
Cocapelli's Gym?
Here in Seminole County?
Yes.
And let's talk a bit about your background, how you got into owning a gym. So maybe we'll go backwards in time. You've owned that
Sure.
gym for about 14 years?
Mm-hmm.
And how about, need to say either yes
Yes.
or no, just so the court reporter, I can understand it, but we need to get it on record. So let's go back before you owned the gym. Were you involved in training or like activities?
Absolutely.
And tell me, if you would, what your first experience was in this area that you've taken on as your career.
I started in the gyms at about 4 years old, and I've been in the gyms my entire life. I started as a competitive athlete and worked into a trainer, and that eventually led into being a gym owner, and it's kind of worked its way. That's what I do now.
Okay, when you say competitive athlete, tell us a bit more about what that means.
I started off as a child playing a variety of competitive sports, including soccer, basketball, racquetball. I actually toured for a while as a pro in racquetball, fighting for boxing and Muay Thai.
Tell me, let's focus then on the experience you've had in fighting, and tell me about that.
I've been involved in fight training for a majority of my life. I started competing regularly after about 18, and I did that for quite a few years.
What type of competing are you speaking of?
For Muay Thai work.
And explain, if you would, to the
Kickboxing.
jury what that is for those of us who don't know.
Very much like boxing, but it's another ring sport like boxing. But with Muay Thai, you're allowed to punch, kick, knee, elbow, clinch. You can hold and hit.
Is that, I guess, closer to what we might call kickboxing?
Yes,
And you competed in that
correct.
for how many years?
I don't know exactly, quite a few.
Okay. During that time, what other training did you do, or how else did you involve yourself in this industry?
I've been around weight training my whole life. My brother's a former Mr. USA and a nationally ranked bodybuilder and powerlifter. So I just grew up in the gym. So I have a fairly extensive background you know, as far as the weight training, and I also have a background with competitive kettlebell lifting.
Okay. Have you ever assisted in other activities around the ring or for other fighters who are in the ring?
Absolutely.
What would that include?
I've worked corners for many, both amateur and professional fighters, for all different levels of competition.
What does working the corner mean?
When you take the fighter to compete, somebody has to take care of the athlete. So when they come back to the corner between rounds, well, actually preparing them to go out to compete, and then when they come back to the corner between rounds, you have to go and make sure that you give them water, any type of cuts, bruising, icing, etc. You have to address accordingly, you know, in a very short period of time, and then send them back out to do the next round.
If I asked you to guesstimate how many times you were a corner man,
Too many to count.
okay? And this is again during the same time that you've been involved in this industry, both doing Muay Thai training and competing and other fighting?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this has been consistent over the last 20 plus years.
If I was to say the term MMA to you, what would you interpret that to mean?
Mixed martial arts, which is a competitive fighting sport that has gotten extremely popular recently.
And is that the stuff that we see if we watch such things on TV, where you see sort of almost a mix of kickboxing, regular boxing, and whatever else you can do?
Yes, in mixed martial arts, it's basically you can do, you know, almost an amalgamation of boxing, kickboxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, submission grappling, to where, you know, you can punch, kick, etc. And then when you get onto the ground, you can work submission holds, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, things of that nature.
Okay. And so within the context of MMA, there are a lot of different disciplines, or are there many different disciplines that can be folded into MMA?
Absolutely.
Some of them would be traditional boxing and, as you said, wrestling.
Correct.
And then some of the more unique ones like Muay Thai.
Absolutely. You know, the beauty of a mixed sport is that you can have different attributes where somebody can be extremely good at one attribute and not very good at another, and still be able to do well in a mixed type of environment.
And the MMA, by definition, allows for many different disciplines and your strengths and weaknesses in those different disciplines to come to the forefront in the ring, right?
Correct.
Are there, within that context of MMA, are there particular moves or holds that are sort of identified or universal?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sure there's probably 1,000.
Well,
I'm going to focus you
quite
on
a few.
Okay, I'm going to focus you on one until you can explain that. Do you know what the term ground and pound means?
Yes.
Have you ever used that maneuver before I have you explain it?
As far as have I had to use it personally?
I guess, yeah.
Well, I didn't. When I was actively competing, I didn't compete in mixed martial arts myself.
Gotcha.
I have trained quite a few others and who have competed in mixed martial arts at, you know, extremely high levels.
Okay. What is a ground and pound?
Basically, for a ground and pound, what you're going to be doing is taking an opponent, putting them on the ground, controlling them, so you're going to be mounted on top of them.
Let's take that a little bit slow. When you say get an opponent on the ground, I'm presuming that they're just not going to say yes if you ask them. So what do you mean?
Absolutely not.
So how do you, in a fight situation, how do you get the opponent on the ground?
Well, you're going to have some means of taking them to the ground, where first you get them on the ground. Once you get them on the ground, then you're going to go and keep them on the ground. And then while you're keeping them on the ground, then you'll go and start striking them from the top downwards.
In mixed martial arts, is there an art to the idea of getting in the first punch or the first blow to take control of a match?
Absolutely.
And tell the jury about that.
As far as the art to
Well,
doing
how do you
that?
do it? What do you do, and why do you do it?
Well, obviously, the reason you're going to do that is to control what's going on with your opponent. So if you're effective with the first blow, that can potentially end the fight immediately.
In mixed martial arts matches, are there referees?
Absolutely.
Are there times? Do they last a certain?
Absolutely.
And how does a fight begin in mixed martial arts?
They begin standing up, where you'll have, nowadays you have a cage, it's very popular, is with the UFC is the octagon, and you'll have opponents on either side, and then referee will stand in the middle, the bell will sound, and then they'll come out and they'll fight.
So there's a bell that documents that the round has begun?
Correct.
Is that such that both opponents would know that?
Correct.
Okay, so now let's talk about the attempt to gain the upper hand, I guess you said, in the first blow or the first punch. I may have interrupted you, or you were explaining that.
Well, rephrase the question, please.
Okay. What is the benefit of trying to get in the first blow or the first punch on your opponent?
Well, if you're effective with it, that's going to go and put you into a much stronger position over your opponent.
On occasion, do those first blows put you in a position where you can get the opponent on the ground?
On occasion, those first blows end a fight.
I was talking again about ground and pound. Once you get the opponent on the floor, you said you mount them. Explain to the jury what you mean by that.
Okay. In positioning, if you have an individual ends up on the bottom, well, if you end up on the ground, you're going to end up in one of two positions, either on the top or on the bottom. If you end up in the bottom, you'll have somebody above you, and depending on what position they're in, they'll be either more or less advantageous for the next movement that they're going to have to make. A mounted position would be something where if a person is lying, say, flat on their back, the person above them would have their legs above the other person's hips. So sitting across the waist, chest, as opposed to what's considered the guard position, where the person on the top would be between the individual's legs.
Okay. At the risk of personal injury, I'm going to ask the court to allow you to step down from the stand to give me an example of a mounted position.
Okay.
How do you stop an MMA fight if you need to?
How do you stop an MMA?
Yes.
Well, the way you stop an MMA fight, if you're the one who's losing, is you can tap. You can say, I quit. You can turn away where you face the other direction.
Keep all of that in mind as we go through this, okay? Tell me where you want me as far as I want you to show the jury what a mounted position is, as you being on top and me being on the bottom.
Okay, so we'll have you just simply lay down. We'll have you on your back. And it might be helpful for them if you're sideways. Okay. So that's fine. So a mounted position, I would be in a position much like this.
And you said a moment ago that your legs are outside of my hips, correct?
Right, as opposed to a guard position where I would be between his legs, which would be much more of this nature, where here he's going to be able to use his hands and his legs and his arms to defend. Here he's not going to have the same ability to use the hands and legs to defend. Here he'd only be able to use his hands, and he'd be impaired somewhat because I'm going to have both my hands and legs available.
Now, if you go to the mounted position again for a moment and tell me why that is a more powerful position.
Well, here I've got a scenario where there's a lot more that I can do to him than what he can do to me. Where you can see in the other scenario, there's more he can do to defend, to escape, to get out of that position.
And while I'm here, how can a person on the bottom attempt to get out from a situation like this?
There's a number of different things a person can do. One of them would be to attempt to pull the person down to bridge and roll over. Another one would be to attempt to escape your hips, which is similar to what's called shrimping.
Sorry, called what?
Shrimping. Or basically you get on your side, push one of my knees down, try to get your hips out, to get your leg around, to put me back into a position where I would be in what's called the guard.
Okay, tap.
And tapping, you get it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sir.
Return back.
Take your seat.
Thanks, sir.
Why, just so we're clear, is the mounted position a powerful position when you're in a fight?
Well, first and foremost, you're on the top. And when you're on the top, you have gravity working for you. So if you strike downward, it's going to be extremely effective comparatively to trying to punch up in the air.
With the concept that you mentioned a moment ago of what I could do on the bottom of shrimping, is that a way of in layman's vernacular, just sort of trying to move myself away and throw you off balance.
Correct.
And if I can, in doing that, can I then get your legs up at least momentarily, or get you off balance?
Oh, yes, absolutely, if you do it well.
Is there a benefit to me trying to simply push myself back this way, away from you, in effect bringing your legs from over my hips to at them or even under them?
Absolutely.
And tell me about that.
Well, if the person who's on the bottom can get into a position from, instead of being mounted, into it's called the guard position, then instead of just having the hands to attempt to defend, they can have the hands and legs to help to defend.
And that would also expose the hips, correct, if you would be able to accomplish that?
What do you mean by expose the hips?
You would get the person on top mounted, you have them further down your legs and not on top of your hips?
Correct.
Because when on top of the hips, what can the person on the bottom do?
They're still mounted. If the person is on the hips or above, it's still mounted. You're not out of the mounted position until the person's actually between your legs.
And then when in a mounted position, then is that where a ground and pound can occur?
Correct.
Is that part of it?
Correct.
So then explain exactly what a ground and pound is.
Well, if you've got somebody who's controlled and they're kind of stuck, they're to a certain extent quasi-helpless. I mean, there are things that can be done from the bottom, but it's going to require a bit more skill versus someone who doesn't have the skill. Generally, if somebody has the skill to put somebody else on the bottom, they usually have the skill to keep them there. Not always, especially with accomplished athletes.
At that point, you're talking about equally trained fighters, correct? One who knows enough on how to get somebody in a mounted position, and the other one knowing, because they're in the ring, how to maybe get out of it.
Correct.
Let's talk a bit more now about Mr. Zimmerman. You know him, do you not?
Absolutely.
And do you
I
recall
do.
when you first met him?
Yes.
About when was that?
That would have been, I want to say, roughly October of 2010.
Okay. And he came to your gym?
Correct.
And what did he come to your gym for?
He came to the gym to lose weight and to get into shape.
And did you assist him in that regard?
Absolutely.
How so?
I put him on a program where we trained him and we gave him a diet to help him to lose weight and get into shape.
Okay. And can you tell the jury then the regimen that you initially came up with for him, both diet and exercise?
Sure.
And how that was accomplished?
We started off, as far as his exercise regime, we started him off with grappling based upon his work and school schedule because of availability. And when we offered the particular classes, we have different classes at different hours of the day, and those particular classes worked for his schedule.
So did he pick his classes then based upon his school and work schedule?
Yes.
It wasn't because he wanted to learn one particular form or idea over the other?
No, I believe when he first came to me, I actually wanted to learn how to box, but the scheduling wasn't available for that, so he chose grappling instead because that was available.
If you would explain to the jury, we may have a little bit here, but explain to the jury what grappling, how you define it, what that is.
How I define grappling?
Yes.
In layman's terms?
Yes.
Think of it much like wrestling, only with wrestling the purpose is to pin the person on the ground. With submission grappling, the goal is for submissions, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, basically make the person say uncle, if you will.
Okay, and any particular moves that you learn within grappling to accomplish that?
Absolutely.
And can you give us some? And describe them a bit so that they're
Sure.
not just words.
There's going to be positioning moves to learn how to control your opponent and how to avoid being controlled. Things like shrimping, bridging, side control, how to go and control your base so that you're able to go and move your hips appropriately. And then, of course, you're going to get into, submissions, chokes, arm locks, leg locks, things
Okay.
of that nature.
Did you said that Mr. Zimmerman involved himself in grappling?
Correct.
Do you recall about how long that training was, how many hours per week or month?
Well, we had the grappling classes were only offered 4 days a week, and for the most part, I think he may have trained 2 to 3 days a week at the most.
Okay. And how long were those classes?
How long is a normal training session?
Yes.
Normal training sessions are 2 hours long.
And did you sort of supervise seeing how he was doing in the grappling?
Well, I supervise all of it.
Okay. Then tell the jury, if you would, just how accomplished he was at grappling.
He wasn't. He was a ranked beginner.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, there's a difference between an accomplished athlete and somebody who's there who's just not physically an accomplished individual. You know, I mean, look, if you look at a professional athlete in any sport, you know, it's really easy to say, well, this guy's just done, you know, a certain amount of work, but there's also a certain amount of predisposition that they have of athleticism, strength, that kind of feeds for that, and then the more they train, the better they get, and the stronger they get, and the faster they get, and things of that nature. So let's say we figured a scale of 1 to 10. If you start off on a scale of 1, you're going to do a lot more work to get to 10. If you start off on a scale of 5, because you've done a bunch of work previously, there's less work it's going to take to get you to 10 comparatively.
Okay.
Usually when you see an accomplished athlete, you know, when they come into a gym, they've already had a history as a child of all kinds of athletics that they've been exposed to. And if you have an adult that hasn't had that type of background exposure, they're going to have a bit more work, and they're probably never going to get to the same degree of accomplishment that somebody who had that childhood background has had.
Along that scale of 1 to 10, when George Zimmerman first got to you, what number would you assign to his abilities?
0.5.
Less than a 1.
Yes.
After, I'm going to sort of fast forward, as a grappler, having been through, well, let me ask this. Tell us about the length of time where Mr. Zimmerman was involved with your gym.
George actually trained, once I looked up the information, it was just under a year, actually about a year that he was actually, you know, part of the gym as far as training goes.
Okay.
And of that, he'd had some time that he had put his membership on hold because of his schedule and whatnot.
Okay. For future purposes, and to keep the record clear, I know that you may call him by his first name, but we're going to use first and last name.
Yes, sir.
George Zimmerman, if you would, just so we keep it very clear.
Yes, sir.
He was there for about a year minus a few months of hiatus, did you say?
Yes.
During that time, then, I understand that he did some grappling, correct? And he did some other type of training?
Boxing training.
Okay. Anything else?
He would occasionally come in to use the facility on his own.
So let's talk about boxing. He came to you, I think you said a 0.5.
Correct.
And do you remember when he left, approximately?
When he left?
When he stopped coming to the gym?
Well, after the incident.
Okay. In the months prior to the incident, presumably that happened in February of 2012, was he coming then, or was that when he was on hiatus?
That's when he was on hiatus.
So going back in time, do you know about the last time he was at the gym?
I don't have an exact date because I don't keep those records necessarily. He had asked me, I want to say, to put his account on hold for November, December, and he might have just started coming back in, January-ish.
Of 2012, meaning that his account was on
Correct.
hiatus in 2011, November?
The end of 2011.
Okay. So during that approximate year, give or take a few months that he was involved with your facility in grappling, he got from 0.5 to what rating would you give him on your scale?
Maybe a 1?
And why
Maybe
so little
1.5?
progress?
Well, it's not that he made such little progress, it's a tremendous amount of work. It's really easy to get the concept that somebody joins up to Gold's Gym and then are automatically a professional bodybuilder, or if somebody joins up to a fight gym, they're a world champion fighter. It just doesn't work that way. It's a tremendous amount of work, takes a lot of dedication, a lot of athleticism.
And did he simply not put that level of work into it?
No, he was very diligent, very coachable, very pleasant to work with. There's just a certain strength level and athleticism, and it takes a tremendous amount of time to develop that. And he didn't have that history and background of childhood athletics that helps to create that.
So on a similar scale, if you would, not in the grappling environment, but just in general athleticism, I think you've identified that you have a feel for where people fit in their abilities based upon their history and athleticism.
Mm-hmm.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would Mr. Zimmerman fit?
Like I said, about a 1.
Generally in his overall athleticism as well?
Well, as far as what I'm looking at in the gym, yes.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk then about his proficiency in the boxing that he took. First of all, tell us what it is, what you do when you start out, and what are you progress to as you learn more about boxing.
Okay. The way we first start in my facility is we start just simply getting proficient within your own body. So if you don't have control of your body, it's going to make sure it's not going to really facilitate other things working well. So if I started somebody in the boxing ring sparring right off the bat before they know how to punch or defend or move, that's going to produce a pretty unpleasant result. So instead of creating that type of situation where it's a liability and people are just getting damaged, they'll start off learning how to control their body. Calisthenics, footwork, ab work, just learning structural integrity and aligning their frame.
Okay.
At the beginning.
And tell me then how Mrs. Zimmerman came to you in the beginning, again on a sort of scale of 1 to 10 as far as his boxing proficiency.
Like 0.5.
Okay. And what did he do then along the way to progress?
He basically just took the normal classes that we offered, and he was diligent about training and working hard. I mean, he was a hard worker, but even a hard worker, without having some of that background, it's still going to take a certain amount of time of development. I've had guys that start off with tremendous levels of athleticism, and they can get themselves to a fighting level generally within about a year, sometimes 2, to actually be a skilled competitor. Because I don't throw people in the ring. There are some gyms that they'll throw somebody in the ring. They've been there for a couple of weeks. They'll just throw them in there. If the person gets hurt, well, too bad for that person. I don't do that. So if somebody's not skilled, they don't get in the ring. That's all there is to it.
Did Mrs. Zimmerman ever get in the ring?
No,
Why not?
because he wasn't skilled enough for that. Mr. Zimmerman, worked diligently at learning how to control his body better than what he had. And, the steps that we'll start off with all those calisthenics, then we'll put the person on the heavy bag where they'll start to learn how to throw a punch with shadow boxing and heavy bag work. And once they get proficient with that, then we'll start pairing them up with a partner for doing defensive counters where somebody would throw a punch at them and they learn how to go and defend the punch, catching, parrying, redirecting, leverage stopping, etc. And then once they got proficient with that, then we'll start learning how to move with slipping and weaving and shuffling and putting some real movement to it.
And what point did George Zimmerman get to in that training sort of progression?
He never got off shadow boxing and hitting the heavy bag and learning how to punch.
So tell me or explain to the jury what that means.
He's still learning how to punch. He didn't know how to really effectively punch.
And what is hitting the heavy bag?
You have a heavy bag, you stand in front of it, you get your hands wrapped up, you put on some bag gloves, and you'd punch the bag. And learning how to have proper biomechanics to use your frame appropriately so you're not going to, to deliver some power to the target without hurting your hands or elbows or shoulders or things of that nature.
Did he ever get to progress to the point where he could box somebody else?
Absolutely not.
And why, you may have just answered this, I apologize, but why would you not let him get to that point, or why did he not get to that point?
It's not a matter of me not letting him get to that point. It's a matter of him simply being physically accomplished to do that. If somebody's not physically accomplished to do that, I'm not going to put them in harm's way.
Did he ever do any, and I think your answer was the same, what was his progression then from the .05? What did he progress to as a boxer?
Well, he never got off of learning how to punch, so not very far. I mean, he improved his physicalness considerably, where he lost a lot of weight because of the diet and the exercise, but regardless of body weight, there's a matter of athleticism, and you can lose all kinds of weight and still not have the athleticism to be ready to climb into the boxing ring with an opponent.
When he came to your gym, was he grossly obese?
Absolutely.
And was that a main focus of his workout regimen?
That was the main focus of why he was there, is to lose weight and to get into better shape.
And was he, in fact, at least accomplishing that?
Absolutely. And he was doing very well with that.
And could you tell what part of that, to the extent that you were aware of it, what part of that was dietary changes and what part of that was the exercise program?
It's both.
Did he try any other, I'm going to call them disciplines? You had mentioned, I think you had mentioned Muay Thai or anything like that. Did he ever endeavor into any of that?
Well, with Muay Thai in my facility, if you can't box, you're not going to learn how to kickbox. You're going to have to learn how to punch before we're going to learn how to kick. So they would go step by step once again. So he never got to a point to where I would start him on learning how to kick because he still didn't have a handle on punching.
Any other progressions in his training while he was at your gym that we've not talked about?
I'm not sure I understand.
Anything else that we've talked about him, a little bit of grappling and boxing, and you gave us, I think, your indication as to how much he had progressed. I'm just curious if there's anything else that I've not asked you about as far as what he learned there or what he progressed in.
That's what he was working off of. Those were the forms of exercise that he was engaging with. He did do a little bit of, weight training on his own because we've got a facility where it's available for that, but that was not a consistent, frequent thing.
And in your corner work, I presume that you've seen people getting injured in fights, correct?
Absolutely.
Almost every time?
No, depending on the skill set of the athlete that's out there. I've had athletes get out there to fight and never even get hit and knock their opponent right out. I've had other guys that come back to the corner and that eye is swelled completely shut.
You had an opportunity to see Mr. Zimmerman shortly after the altercation with Mr. Martin, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury when that was?
I don't know the exact date, but I would say it was within a couple of days after the incident.
And describe him, if you would, if you noticed what he looked like.
He had black eyes, his nose was scraped up, he had some bandages on his head, and that as far as the obvious, physical bruising that he had. He looked emotionally traumatized.
Have you seen that in fighters that you've worked with?
I've seen that in people, and generally not in fighters after they've been competing for a while. A little bit different. He had the look of a human being who had been through an extremely traumatic experience and was traumatized from it. Almost like a state of shock that was continuing.
Did he have a conversation with you where he discussed shrimping in regards to this event?
Yes, he did.
What was that?
When he came...
Please approach. Objection sustained.
As far as you had testified regarding his athleticism, what words within that context, how would you define George Zimmerman?
Non-athletic. I think probably the best way of describing it, I had happened to have had a meeting with one of my other trainers that I saw, happened to be yesterday. Had a very brief conversation with him, and when I first mentioned what I was going to be coming to testify, he didn't realize that this was the same person that we were referring to.
Sustained.
Not,
Let me.
hold on one second. I was asking you for you to describe Mrs. Zimmerman, and I think you were going to give us a story about maybe how somebody else described him? That's been objected to and sustained, which means you can't tell us what the other person said.
Yep.
But if you can tell us in your words.
He was, and I really don't like to use this type of terminology.
We've heard words that we
I'm
normally
sure.
don't use. So.
Soft. He's just physically soft. He's not a, he was a overweight, large man when he came to us, and a very, very pleasant, very nice man, but physically soft. He was predominantly fat, not a lot of muscle, and not a lot of strength.
A moment, Your Honor. Within the context of at least organized fighting, you had mentioned a couple of different ways to end a fight, be tapping out.
Yes, sir.
Does screaming for help work?
If you're in a competitive situation, you can verbally tap out by saying, "I quit," and then the referee will step in and assist.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to let you plug your gym for a minute. Would you tell us what your slogan is?
I'm sorry?
Tell me the slogan of your gym, if you would.
The slogan of our gym is "Learn without getting hit."
You ever call it anything about being the most complete fight gym in the world?
Well, some time ago, we've got a rather large facility, and so some time ago, we'd set up on our website, because there was really no facilities around that had full weight training facilities and full fight training facilities. So we put it as the most complete fight gym in the world. At that point, that was accurate. Things have changed, and now there's a lot of gyms that have followed suit to what I do, and they've updated their facilities now to have weights and whatnot as well.
Speaking of other gyms, I understand that Mr. Zimmerman was going to yours for, I guess, somewhere, I think you said between October of 2010 and the end of 2011. Then he took a couple months off and then came back?
Basically.
Okay. Do you know, if at all, he might have been going anyplace else, whether that was another gym that you mentioned, or just working out at home, or working out at, for example, some apartment complexes or communities have fitness centers, that sort of thing? Any idea whether he was doing any of that?
Not to my knowledge. We've got a very unusually complete facility, and it makes it really easy, and we kind of give a lot of leeway of access to the facility for the members. So he's got access to a place that would be unlike any place else that would be available to him. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense for him to be going somewhere else, and he was a very loyal type of individual, so I don't foresee him going some other facility.
Would you have encouraged him to work out sort of on his own? I mean, something as simple as going for a run on his own, or lifting some weights at home, or anything like that.
If generally, I encourage my students to come to as many training sessions as possible so they can have supervised instruction so that they're not creating bad habits.
Would you tell him not to work out alone?
I would tell them to come in for more training sessions at our facility.
The weight that the defendant lost was in the ballpark of 90 pounds or better, right?
I don't have an exact measurement, but when he first started, he was in, I want to say, between 250 and 260 pounds, and he would have lost, between 50 to 80 pounds.
Okay. And actually, I think you testified before that his body mass index was somewhere between 15 and 20% body fat.
I don't have the exact amount because I didn't do a body fat analysis on him, but I would think that he probably had a little bit more body fat than that.
Okay. Do you remember talking about somewhere between 16 and 20%?
I remember hearing and looking at a deposition on that, and I saw the numbers on there. And when I saw the numbers on there, it seemed a little odd to me because it seemed a little bit low for him.
You certainly don't deny that that's what you said, right?
I'm not arguing whether I said that or not.
Okay. As far as, I guess let's talk about the first blow advantage type of thing first, right? The first
Sure.
blow can be a very good advantage in a combat situation.
Correct.
And you would have taught, I guess, all of your students this fact.
Well, I'm not going to start teaching somebody about strategy if they don't have a base of fundamentals.
Would they have absorbed this or seen this or heard it talked about? Any chance of that?
I mean, is there a chance of that? Sure, you can turn on the TV and figure some things out, but that's not something that I'm going to teach a beginner as far as strategy goes if they don't have the basis of fundamentals.
It's not a big advantage, though, if you don't execute it properly or well.
Well, it's not going to do anything for you if you don't do anything with it.
Could put you actually in a worse position.
Potentially.
Okay. Leaves you kind of open for a quick counterattack.
Potentially.
As far as grappling itself goes, you said that that was actually what you started the defendant in, right?
Correct.
Okay. And I think you characterized it as sometimes when you're rolling around on the ground, a lot of things can happen to you.
Correct.
Scuffed up, marked, scraped, sometimes even cut.
Depending on what you're rolling around on, absolutely.
Okay. And you talked about some techniques, bridging and shrimping and that sort of thing. Those are designed actually to move you from a unfavorable position to a less unfavorable position.
Correct.
And they're designed to effect that change of position as quickly as you can do it.
Correct.
Because when you're grappling, that's actually a fairly physically exhausting situation.
Absolutely.
And is that why they fight in, I guess, some, we could call them short rounds, but obviously you've been a professional. You know that sometimes even a 3-minute round can seem like forever.
A 1-minute round can seem like an eternity if you're not in condition for it.
Right. And so the goal of some of those techniques that we're taught, the shrimping, the bridging, that sort of thing, is actually to take yourself from being, as you put it, in a, perhaps if someone had you in a mounted situation, to be able to reverse that or at least get out of where you are.
To get into a not quite as bad situation, for sure, or reverse it.
Okay. And you said you also taught submission, arm locks, and that sorts of things, right?
Correct.
Those are also designed to be applied in a grappling scenario, even perhaps if you're not able to do much of anything else. In other words, when you can't strike, sometimes you could use a different type of hold.
I'm not sure I understand what you're going at with this.
Okay. If you can't, you mentioned that a person on the bottom sometimes, it's going to be hard to strike upward.
Correct.
Could you grab a hold of, for example, an arm and apply one of the grappling holds in lieu of actually being able to punch?
Potentially, yes, depending on the position that you're in. If you're in a mounted position, grabbing someone's arm to attempt to submit them from simply grabbing their arm is not a particularly practical thing. It's not going to work.
It wouldn't work well, but that would be a grappling maneuver, the arm lock.
Well, the arm lock is not going to be applied if you're on your back being mounted. You can't arm lock somebody from that position.
So it wouldn't even be possible to do.
Well, you'd have to be extremely skilled, and you'd have to have, there's a couple of obscure angles that could be implemented from, but you'd have to be extremely skilled to do it.
Would you say that someone like the defendant had the skill to be able to do that?
Absolutely not.
So
Not
no
even
way.
close. No way. No way.
And if he said he did it, you wouldn't believe it.
No. Absolutely not. As far as submitting somebody with an arm bar from while he's being mounted, no.
Okay. Let's talk about striking for a little while, if we could. The punching. And I know that the Muay Thai, you get into the kicking and the knees and the elbows. Punching, you would teach a number of different strikes, right? The jab, the cross, the hook.
Uppercuts.
All of those?
Yep.
And you said you had him working with a heavy bag. Would you ever do the sparring mitts with someone where you...
If they don't know how to control their body to throw a punch properly without hurting their wrists or their elbows on a heavy bag in shadow boxing, putting them on focus mitts is... I'm not going to do that with them.
Is that a no? You never put him on mitts?
No.
What weight were his gloves?
He had bag gloves, which were going to be light, as opposed to like a 16-ounce boxing glove or sparring glove. Generally, an old school bag glove is probably 4 to 6 ounces.
Okay. And you'd have him wrist wrapped and everything like that?
Correct.
So to help avoid hurting himself when he punched?
Correct.
Because the idea is you punch hard enough that you should hurt the thing you're striking.
Well, if you don't have good support in your hands and you hit hard, you can hurt your hands and your wrists.
And when you would have him do these workouts for, I think you said like the first hour was the calisthenics and the cardio and that sort of thing, and then the second hour would be the skill development portion?
Correct.
So for this hour that he's working on his punching technique, he would be using all of those punches.
What do you mean, all those punches?
Would you be having him work on just jabs, or would you be having him work
At the
on?
beginning, he's going to work on just footwork, and then structural integrity and how to learn how to hold and posture his body, and then learn how to throw a jab. And once he starts to get proficiency with the jab, then we'll start bringing in a straight right hand, and then we'll start bringing in a hook. And once he starts to get proficient with those to where he's not hurting himself and he can work, then we'll start putting combinations of those punches together.
And just like with grappling, sitting in there trying to throw nothing but punches for an entire minute, that can get pretty exhausting pretty quick too.
Without question.
You mentioned teaching positioning of hands and positioning of feet. The hands, you would teach the hands up guarded position, right? When you're teaching punching.
As opposed to the hands down guarded position?
Let me put that better. You're supposed to guard your face so that you can peek over and see your target, but not, that if you do get hit, what you get hit with bumped by is your own gloves, right?
More or less.
Okay. Would you teach the proper position to hold your hands?
Correct.
And I think you said that you offered the classes about 4 times a week, and he went, best you can tell, 2 or 3 times a week.
That was the grappling classes. We offer more of the boxing classes and striking classes. We have more classes available.
Okay.
And at different hours.
So 2 or 3 times just for grappling.
Mm-hmm.
Is that yes?
Correct. Now, he did not do grappling and striking training sessions simultaneously. He did one or the other.
All right. So if he did 2 grappling sessions a week, then we might have 1 striking session?
No.
No?
No, he did a number of months where he did just the grappling sessions, and then his school schedule or work schedule, whatever it was, changed. And so he came to me and asked, well, what can we do because my schedule changed? And the time slots worked for him to be able to go into the boxing classes.
Interspersed with those would be what you referenced, the occasional weightlifting and the other sessions that he would do.
What other sessions?
You mentioned that he would sometimes come in to work out and weightlifting and things on his
Right.
own. Okay.
Right.
So we're talking.
But that was not a very regular thing. Probably a dozen times over the course of the year that I, recall seeing him come in to go and
once or twice a month.
something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So we're talking somewhere between, sounds like 6 to 10 hours a week, depending on what week it was.
I think no, 6 to 10 hours a week is a little bit more than he did.
Okay. Aren't the sessions 2 hours?
2 hours long, and if he trained 3 times a week, that would have been 6 hours.
Okay.
So it wouldn't have been any more than 6 hours a week. That would have been a max.
All right.
And there were certain weeks that he had things come up that he didn't show up at all.
And when a person works out at your gym, I guess y'all take care, try to make sure people don't hurt themselves.
Correct.
That they don't get in situations they can't handle.
Correct.
And you would never want them to put themselves in a situation that they weren't ready to handle.
Correct.
Let me just ask you, occasionally that would happen anyway?
I'm sorry?
Would that occasionally happen anyway, not under your supervision, but you've said that you've seen people try and get in the ring and fight and do things that they're just not ready to do?
Oh, I've seen that not in my facility. I've seen that in other gyms before.
People think they can do it and they're not ready to do it?
Absolutely.
Okay. Doesn't stop them from trying, it just stops them from having a good outcome?
Correct.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you. Another question, Judge?
Thank you. Any redirect?
Very briefly, Your Honor. So as to when we talk about the progression, his proficiency in boxing, jabbing, and then other things, hooks and whatnot, had he gotten at any level of proficiency where you could work with him on other strikes, or was it just still punching the bag?
Just punching the bag and shadow boxing. And the actuality, he'd really predominantly just worked on throwing the jab in the right hand and just, barely starting to learn how to throw a hook.
Okay. So he had not yet gotten proficient in the jab. Would that be accurate?
He had not gotten truly proficient with all of it.
Or with any of it?
No. I mean, he was doing pretty good within his own scope with the stretches and exercises, and he was a hard worker, but he was not an accomplished athlete in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. When Mr. Manti asked you about arm locks and things like that, you were talking about somebody who's fairly proficient in it, correct?
They'd have to be from the positions he was discussing.
Did you train Mrs. Zimmerman at all in anything having to do with arm locks or things like that?
He wasn't accomplished enough for that.
Okay, so he had not gotten any experience in arm locking or something?
Well, he'd
anything
been
like
around in a class when we were covering things of that nature as far as chokes and arm locks, but that was not something that he could pull off.
But even if I never came to your gym, if you jumped on top of me, I might grab your arm and try and
Oh,
take it
absolutely.
away, right?
Absolutely.
That would not be what you would define as an arm lock, would it?
Not even close.
There would just be a grabbing of a hand?
It's a reflex. Understand, what we do is we try to go and train a skill set to where you're having conditioned reflexes. That takes quite a bit of work.
You had said you defined Mr. Zimmerman as soft sort of in the beginning of all of this. How was he when he left your gym? How would you define him?
Well, he had lost quite a bit of weight, so he was in physically better shape as far as the amount of fat he was carrying comparatively, but he was still had a long way to go. He wasn't, shredded and ripped like a, competitive fighter or a bodybuilder or anything of that nature. He still had more body fat to lose. He still could have stood to use to go and gain a bit of muscle. He was greatly improved from the way he'd first started, but he was by no means ready for being a competitive athlete by any stretch.
As far
or
as
even
his,
dealing with any type of competitive athlete.
as far as his athleticism, at the end when you last saw him in the gym, would you still consider him soft?
Absolutely.
Nothing further than you want to think.
Thank you. May Mr. Pollock be excused? Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
excuse. Call your next witness, please.
Any chance this might be a decent time for a break? I can organize witnesses a little bit.
Sure, we'll take a 15-minute recess. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your notepads face down on the chair and follow Deputy Jarvis back into the jury room. Seated, court will be in recess for 15 minutes. Please be seated. Counsel, please approach for a moment. Let me know when you're ready to bring the jury back in. Okay, thank you. State ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please bring the jury back in. Please be seated. Mr. O'Mara, call your next witness, please.
Defense will call Tracy Martin, Your Honor.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
State your name, please.
Tracy Benjamin Martin.
And, of course, you're Trayvon Martin's father.
Yes,
You've been here for the testimony throughout the trial, correct?
correct.
Including today when we had a couple of officers testifying about an event where you had gone to meet with Investigator Chris Serino at Sanford Police Department.
Correct.
Remember that?
Yes,
Do you remember the event itself, having gone down there? I believe you went with Brandy Green.
yes.
Okay. Did you have a conversation with Officer Serino about why he wanted you down at the station?
Yeah, initially, we were going down to the police department to make sure that he had verified that Trayvon had been identified. Detective Serino didn't bring me to the station. I actually went to the station myself.
Okay. With Miss Green?
Correct.
And at some point, you did go back to his sort of office cubicle area and listen to some tapes, is that correct?
Correct.
My understanding is, from my knowledge of the discovery, was that you listened to a number of tapes, one of which was the tape that we're identifying as the Lauer 911 call, correct?
Yes.
And he did play that for you?
Yes.
And were you listening to it as he played it for you?
Yes.
Understand that it was difficult to listen to. It included the shot that ended your son's life, correct?
Yes.
At the end of that tape, do you recall Officer Serino asking you whether or not you could identify your son's voice?
Not those exact words, but something to that nature, yes.
Okay. Do you recall the words as best you can recall that he used?
As best as I recall, after he played the tape, he basically just said, "Do you recognize the voice?"
And what was your response?
My response was just simply, tell him that I didn't know. I didn't tell him, no, that wasn't Trayvon. I think the chairs had wheels on them, and I kind of pushed away from the table and just kind of shook my head and said, I can't tell.
So your words were, I can't tell.
Something to that effect, but I never said, no, that wasn't my son's voice.
You heard Officer Serino testify that you said no, correct?
Correct.
And you heard Officer Singleton also testify that she was about 8 or 10 feet, and she heard you say no, or an indication that you acknowledged it was not Trayvon's voice. Is that correct?
Before Officer Singleton even testified, the first time Officer Singleton testified, that was the first time I ever seen her. I had no idea that she was even in the vicinity.
Right, you didn't notice her there, correct?
No.
But you heard her testify that she heard you, correct?
Yes, I heard her testify.
As you were here today.
I heard her testify to that, but I didn't see her in the room.
Okay. Did you ever say to anyone, did you ever ask to hear the tape a second time?
Not at that moment, no.
Did you ever tell anybody that you had listened to a cleaned up version of the tape and were then able to identify the voice on it?
What do you mean cleaned up version?
I'm asking you, sir.
To my knowledge, the tape that I listened to is the same tape that's circulating. That's the only tape I know of. I have no knowledge of a cleaned up version.
Okay. So the question then is, did you ever tell anybody, your attorney or anybody else?
I never told anyone that I listened to a cleaned up version of the tape.
Okay. Or an enhanced version?
I have no knowledge of an enhanced version.
Did you ever tell Sabrina Fulton, your ex-wife, that you had listened to the tape at Officer Serino's desk?
I hadn't told her, no.
Was there any reason why you didn't give her that information?
There was a lot of stuff going on. We had just buried our son. A lot of emotions, and you just don't think of every little detail that you've been through. Obviously it was a tragic and still is a tragic time for us. So just to answer your question, did I tell Ms. Fulton that I listened to the tape? No, I didn't. Now,
You were at the mayor's office when the tape was played for the entire family, correct?
Correct.
And you were there as well, listening to the tape?
Yes.
Did you ever take an opportunity to tell Ms. Fulton or any of the other family members before the tape was played what they were going to hear?
No, I didn't.
Is there any reason why you didn't advise them of that?
I'm sure they were aware of what we were doing at the mayor's office, so there was no reason for me to confirm, in fact, that we were there to listen to the tapes.
And was it at that time in the room with everybody else? What did you say about the tape when you listened to it that time in the mayor's office?
What do you mean, what did I say?
Did you acknowledge anything about the tape to anybody?
After listening to the tape for maybe 20 times, I said I knew that it was Trayvon's voice. I didn't direct that towards any family members. Matter of fact, I think the family members had started leaving out the room. It was too much for them. They couldn't take it. And I just decided to sit there and listen to it.
Had you listened to the tape between the time that Officer Serino played it for you on about the 28th of February and about the 16th of March when you heard it in the mayor's office?
No, listened to it in Detective Serino's cubicle and then again in the mayor's office.
Okay, no time in between?
No.
Okay. Have a moment, Your Honor? Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Cross.
Mr. Martin, even at this time, is it hard for you to believe that your son is not longer living?
It's very difficult to believe that Trayvon's not living.
Okay.
As I said over and over, that was my best friend in life, and to have him gone is tragic.
You were asked two areas that I want to cover with you that Mr. O'Mara asked you about. The 911 call that you heard, or the calls, the recordings that you heard at SPD, or Sanford Police Department. You remember going there?
Yes,
Now, in terms of this jury understanding the context, that your son was killed late evening Sunday, February 26th. And you would have gone over to the Sanford Police Department the morning of the I believe it's the 28th. Do you recall that?
yes,
And I believe also you really found out your son was dead at some point, actually the 27th. Is that true? That
correct.
Monday?
Yes,
Okay. And was it still hard for you to believe that your son was dead?
it's still hard to this day that he's dead.
Okay. And officers had come to your house, I believe, on the 27th and told you that your son was dead, right? First, they wanted to verify that that was your son, in terms of, because he didn't have a ID with him, so they wanted for you to verify that he was the person that they found out in the courtyard of that retreat at Twin Lakes where Brandy Green lived, right?
Correct.
Okay. And I gather you went and got a picture of your son just to show them who your son was, or did they show you a picture of the person that at that time was just described as an unknown person out of the courtyard? They showed you a picture of a body there on the ground, correct?
Check, Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes.
All right, proceed, Your Honor. Mr. Martin, I was asking you about the 27th. Detective Serino, or Investigator Serino, had come and showed you a photograph. Is that correct? And you identified it as being your son, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now we move to the 28th, where they asked you to go down to the police station, correct?
Correct.
And you go down with your fiance at the time, Brandy Green, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at that time, they played several recordings to you, correct?
Yeah, they played a series of the 911 calls.
Okay. And these were calls where neighbors that had called in regarding what you now knew was the death of your son, correct?
Correct.
Right? And the recordings were of people calling and explaining that somebody had been shot, and I'm sure you listened to the person now identified as Ms. Gordyka, the lady who went hysterical in the 911 call. You were listening to all that, is what I'm saying.
To my recollection, I don't think Detective Serino played each call in its entirety.
Okay,
He played some of the, to my knowledge, he played some of each call leading up to the last call with the fatal shot.
all right. So they played the call then of the cries for help, and then you actually hear a shot, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And am I safe to assume that you still at that time were in denial, in the sense of not wanting to believe that your son was dead?
Correct.
Okay. And this was an emotional time for you, would that be fair to say?
Very emotional.
I must object and refer to the
Then give
court's,
me your,
your previous ruling.
okay, we're now on to the day of the phone calls being played overruled.
This was a very emotional time for you while this was going on, in terms of, I'm talking about the day the recording was played for you at the Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you listened to the recording, and as you stated, described to the jury, you pulled your chair back in disbelief that you were actually listening to voices for help, and also, more importantly, also a shot.
Correct.
You realized that that was the shot.
That killed my son, yes.
Did you really know what to do at that point?
No, my world was from that point until today, my world has just been turned upside down.
Okay. And let's focus on that day. Then, after you heard the cries for help, or the recording that's been referred to as the Lauer recording, and then also the shot, at that same time, or right there, Investigator Serino asked you about the recording, if you could recognize the voice, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm assuming that was difficult for you to even contemplate identifying or not identifying the voice, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And as best you could, you attempted to answer Investigator Serino, is that true?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as was pointed out, there was a lot of commotion in that recording, wasn't there? The yells for help, the person calling, and then most importantly, the shot, too. How,
Yeah.
in terms of your mind, what was going through your mind, can you describe through your jury what was going through your mind when you were listening to that?
Basically, what I was listening to, I was listening to my son's last cry for help. I was listening to his life being taken, and I was trying to come to grips that Trayvon was here no more. It was just tough.
And as Mr. O'Mara pointed out, subsequent time you were present when that recording was played again at the mayor's office. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I believe your former wife, Ms. Fulton, was present, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I think you said you wanted to listen to it. Did you listen to that recording and then other recordings at that time too?
I can't remember. I can't remember if it was all of the 911 calls or was it just that last 911 call. But I do remember that I took whole control of the mouse or the clicker or whatever it was that they had, and I was able to rewind that same tape over and over again.
Do you want to, I guess, hear your son's voice over and over? Did that bring you any comfort, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask.
Object again, and same relevancy objection as before, and the court ruled on.
Overruled.
May I have the question read back for some further argument? Because
No, I'll be glad to rephrase the question.
Okay, thank you.
You were playing that recording over and over. You were still dealing with this?
Yes,
His death?
Yes.
Now, it was sometime in March. It was later. It wasn't like days later. You were still having to deal with his death?
Correct.
Okay. And you played it, you said, did you actually write down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you're estimating you played it at least 20 times?
I'm estimating that I played it maybe 20 times.
Okay. And you played it over and over. Why? Were you trying to deal with this, or why were you doing that?
Wasn't as much as I was trying to deal with it. I was just trying to figure out on the night of February 26, 2012, why did the defendant get out of his vehicle and chase my son?
And you weren't there when it happened, correct?
Correct.
And this recording, I guess, is one of the last things in terms of hearing the voice in the shot. You were trying to, as best you can, figure out what happened or why it happened.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. No further questions.
Can you redirect?
Yes. Do you believe that the police lied when the two officers said that you said no about it being your son?
Objection, Your Honor, is improper about what somebody else is saying.
Foundation question for another one, Your Honor. I think it's necessary.
Well, you have to rephrase your question because it's not proper
Okay.
to have a witness comment on another witness's
I'll do it this way
testimony.
then. Did you ever instruct your attorney, Ben Crump? You didn't have Ben Crump when you listened to the tape on the 27th, the 28th, did you?
No.
He was not your attorney at that point?
No, it wasn't.
Later, did you instruct him to say that the police lied when they said that you couldn't tell, when they said that you had said no about it being your son's voice? Did you instruct your lawyer to say that?
I never instructed anyone to say anything.
You never instructed Ben Crump to say that the police had lied about that?
I never instructed anyone to say anything.
Did you instruct your lawyer, Ben Crump, to say that the audio has since been cleared up and now you can hear it better?
No, I didn't.
Nothing further. Your Honor.
Thank you. May Mr. Martin be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. Subject to recall, obviously.
Okay, Mr. O'Mara, may Mr. Martin step down?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you, sir. You may step down. Call your next witness, please.
Chief Bill Lee, Your Honor.
Okay.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
You may inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Afternoon, sir. State your name, please.
My name is Billy Ray Lee, Jr.
And on February 26, 2012, what was your occupation?
I was the chief of police for the city of Sanford.
You're no longer in that position?
No, sir.
When did that end?
June 22nd, 2013. 2012, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Were you then chief of police during the initial investigation stages of the case that brings us here today, State versus George Zimmerman?
Yes, sir.
If you would just tell the jury a little bit about your background in law enforcement.
I have 30 years of law enforcement experience. I started at the Seminole County Sheriff's Office as a road patrol deputy in 1982. I was promoted through the ranks to the position of captain. I retired in 2009 at that rank of captain in charge of our Special Operations Division and Emergency Services Division. 9 years of that experience was in investigations, 5 years as an investigator, 4 as a supervisor.
And where'd you grow up?
I was born and raised in Sanford.
It's your hometown?
Yes, sir.
Did becoming chief of Sanford Police Department then be sort of a pinnacle in your career for as law enforcement?
Yes, it was.
How long were you with Sanford PD as its chief?
I'm sorry,
How long were you with Sanford PD as its chief?
from May of 2011 to June of 2012.
Did you say that you came out of retirement in order to take that position?
I retired from the Seminole County Sheriff's Office and took a position with Seminole State College as their director of the Center for Public Safety. We provided training, certificate training in the areas of law enforcement, corrections, firefighting, and paramedic and EMT services, and also a 2-year degree program in each of those disciplines.
And were you then sort of recruited from that teaching position to get reactivated in law enforcement as the chief of Sanford PD?
That position came available while I was still at the Sheriff's Office, and I applied for that.
Particular to this case then, I presume that you were you hands-on or were you just in a supervisory role over the investigation with the George Zimmerman case?
I was in a supervisory or administrative role at the police department.
But did you have particular focus on this case as well as time went on from February 26th during the time that you still had involvement in the case?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did that also include the playing of a 911 call for the Martin family members? Were you aware of that decision? And I want to focus you at this point, simply were you aware that that decision had been made, that the tape was going to be played for the Martin family?
My recommendation was that the 911...
I want to be careful a little bit. That's why I focused the question. I don't want to spend a lot of time dealing with the decision to play the tape. I want to focus once that decision was made, we'll talk about then that point forward. So you are aware, were you not, that a decision was made that the tape would be released to be played to the Martin family. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. Once that decision had been made, I want to focus you on the way that the recording was played for the Martin family, okay?
Yes, sir.
So, generally speaking, with your experience in law enforcement, within the context of what we will call lineups, or whether that be a visual lineup or an audio lineup, what are the best practices as to how to handle lineups generally?
Generally, just as in, for example, a photo lineup, you would show that photo array or that piece of evidence to a potential witness in a case individually.
Okay. And what is the purpose of doing it individually rather than in a group?
So their decision is not influenced.
One from the other? One witness influencing another witness?
Yes, sir.
So if, in fact, you were showing, as an example, a photo lineup to this jury and asked them if they could pick out me, would you do it as a group, as a jury, or would you do it individually, one juror at a time?
You should do it individually.
And the purpose of doing it individually as opposed to a group?
So their identification would not be influenced by others'
Is
response.
that a similar process then to what would be done with an audio lineup?
Should be, yes, sir.
And an audio lineup, similar to a photo lineup, is just having somebody listen to a piece of evidence to see if they can identify anything in that piece of evidence?
Yes, sir.
And that was what was going to happen in this case once the decision was made to play to the Martin family, correct? That it was going to be played for them?
It was my understanding that one member of their family had already listened to that tape. You know, again, my recommendation.
Right, we're going to talk, I want to talk about your recommendation as to anything other than once the decision was made, what was your recommendation as to how the tape should be played for the family members?
It should be played individually.
Do you know the result of how it was played? Was it played individually or as a group?
It's my understanding it was played in a group setting in the mayor's office.
Was law enforcement present?
No, sir.
In your years of experience, how is that normally an event that would be handled by law enforcement?
Yes, sir.
May I have a moment, Your Honor? In this particular case, then, did you ask to be present during the time that the recording was to be played by for the family?
I offered to be present. Yes, sir.
And was that accepted?
No, sir.
Were you excluded from the room?
Yes, sir.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
The mayor made a decision not to have you in there, is that correct?
I believe I asked the city manager if he wanted me to be in the
Right.
room, and they declined to have me.
City manager was your boss?
That's correct, yes, sir.
And so is the mayor, I'm assuming, too, by virtue of that? or-
In my position, my contract was with the city manager.
Okay, all right. And the recording itself was played in the mayor's office, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And you weren't, I apologize, did I interrupt you?
No.
Did you finish answering?
I did.
Okay, thank you. And you were not present when the recording was played, correct?
I was not present in the mayor's office, no,
I
sir.
think you were in the same building, but not in the mayor's office when it was played.
That's correct.
Did I have that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you were asked about the lineup, and just so the jury knows, in case they haven't heard of a lineup, what you're talking about is you don't want to have a suggestive. In other words, you don't want to have, normally a lineup includes 6 photographs, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have a person look at the lineup and then identify if they know one of the individuals that did something to them or was a witness or whatever. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what you don't want to do is show them a photograph, just one by itself, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, also, in a lineup, you don't want a potential witness to a crime to have seen something on TV saying, this is the person, and this case is about this, and here's a photograph. You don't want to do that either, correct?
Preferably not. Yes,
Right?
sir.
Because that would be kind of tainting it, correct?
Correct.
So, in other words, if your experience, you had a case and the witness said, oh, I saw the photograph on TV or I heard the voice on TV and it was, they broadcasted regarding the case of Joe. Joe was a suspect. That would be tainted, correct?
Possibly.
Okay. And the reason is because then the person potentially was influenced by the fact that the case dealt with Joe, and they knew Joe was arrested, and there's a photograph of Joe, then that would be tainted, potentially, correct?
Possibly, yes, sir.
Okay. And that also would apply to voice, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I mean, voice and photo lineups, you kind of do the same thing, correct?
If you can, yes, sir.
Right, and when you say a voice lineup, you would actually have 6 separate recordings, to be fair in terms of completely accurate. You would have 6 separate voices, then you would have the person actually listen to all 6, and then say, if you did it similar to a photo lineup, you would have a person then say, which one do you recognize, correct?
If you could have 6
Right.
audio recordings that were similar in nature, and when you
Right.
prepare a lineup, there's supposed to be certain characteristics of that person that is the subject of that photo lineup that is similar to all the other photographs in the photo array.
Right, just like if you had a photo array, you wouldn't pick if the suspect had a beard, you wouldn't put one person with a beard and the other people without beards, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Because that would be suggestive, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, and so the jury understands, so in other words, you don't want somebody potentially making a decision based on what they've seen on TV of the photograph or the voice ID versus actually listening to it without having watched anything on TV about the case.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Please, just so we're clear on this case, the issue of who was screaming for help on the tape was still an issue that you, as the agency investigating the case, was looking into, correct?
We had, the evidence and testimony that we had gave us an indication of whose voice it was screaming for help on the tape, but any other witnesses that we could try to corroborate that would be beneficial in trying to find the truth.
And the indications that you had from the other evidence was that it was George Zimmerman's voice.
Beyond scope.
Beyond the scope, sustained.
But as to the tape itself and playing it for other witnesses, the potential witnesses are the Martin family themselves, were they not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Mr. DeLeon suggested that you'd go out and get 6 voices, but the reality in this case was that you would have done it in a way where each Martin family member would have listened to it themselves and come up with their own opinion as to who they heard, correct?
Objection as to Levy.
Overruled.
That means you can answer.
Can you ask the question again?
Sure.
Thank you.
Within the confines of this case, is the best practice in this case, would the best practice have been to allow, once the decision was made, to have them listen to the tape? Would the best police practices have suggested that you let each family member listen to it individually and get their statement as to what they heard?
If it was for investigative purposes, to let the person that was going to listen to it individually, so that you can get their response without influence.
And that you would avoid the influence of having them all listen to it at one time, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree that in an emotional circumstance such as this one would be, that the possibility for influence is even greater?
It's possible, yes, sir.
Now, you had said that it was the city manager, in response to a question by Mr. Deloyonda. The city manager doesn't normally make police decisions, does he?
No, sir.
Does he go out and fight fires?
No, sir.
Leaves that to the fire department?
Yes, sir.
Leaves police work to the police department?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you. May Mr. Lee be excused?
Yes, I don't have any further questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You're excused.
We had discussed that this might be a good time to end for the day, and I would ask for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, although you might think that it's early to go for the day, which is 4:27, we have some matters that we do have to take care of outside your presence. So instead of keeping you back in the jury room, I'm going to excuse you for the evening. During the evening recess, you're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology. And you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, or blogs or social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Yes. Okay, with that, put your notes face down, follow Deputy Jarvis back, and have a good evening. Okay, please be seated. From my notes, I had 5 different things that were, actually 6 matters that we were going to take up at this time. One of them was the state's motion to strike Mr. Donnelly's testimony and have a Richardson hearing on that. There is the state's motion in limine regarding toxicology, the animation, and Mr. Root. And then there was the state's motion to strike testimony from Officer Serino and Officer Singleton. In light of the fact that Mr. Martin has testified, is the state still moving to strike that testimony?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, then those are two things that are off the plate. So that leaves the Richardson hearing regarding Donnelly, toxicology, animation, and Mr. Root. Is there a preference from either side as to how you want to take those up?
I would imagine the Richardson inquiry would be the most direct and probably the easiest, Your Honor.
Okay, let's go ahead and begin with that.
Are you asking for my response? I know that the state had
Right.
made some argument.
The state's argument for the record was that the allegation was that the defense had a knowledge prior to Mr. Donnelly testifying that he was going to identify Mr. Zimmerman's voice on the 911 tape, and that at the time of his deposition back in May of 2013, I believe it was May, he did not indicate that he had listened to the tape or had an opinion as to the identification of the voice. And his testimony here today was that he listened to the tape this past Saturday, which was July 6th, and spoke with Mr. O'Mara that afternoon, and that information had not been revealed to the state. So the Richardson hearing is to determine whether or not that was a discovery violation, number one, and number two, what prejudice it is to the state.
Okay. And I don't know.
Am I correct in my recitation?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Your Honor, the only thing, if I could, I would add that it's not like there was no opportunity to communicate that information. As the court knows, yesterday, counsel spent several hours together taking a deposition of another witness. And I will say, too, I haven't been able to verify it yet, but there have been some individuals who've indicated that Mr. Donnelly may have actually been present in the courtroom at some point last week during part of this trial. Again, I don't have a confirmation on that, but
Okay, well, that's not part of a Richardson
Understand.
hearing. That would be another issue.
yes, Your Honor. And so for the record, his deposition was middle of page 14, and the question was, have you listened to any of the 911 calls? Answer, I do not believe so, no, sir. Question, so you have not formed an opinion about who uttered whatever was uttered? Answer, no, sir. And that is the material change, and I've provided the court 3 cases, and I believe that as far as the prejudice goes, the cases outline those, and I can go into that further, or give Mr. O'Mara a turn. I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, the question is going to be the prejudice. I mean, I think that Mr. O'Mara acknowledges that that information was not provided to the state yesterday or before Mr. Donnelly testified today. So the prejudice issue is what would happen, or what would the state have done differently had you known that information?
Well, I think the first case that I provided, Your Honor, and the issue, I guess, is procedural prejudice. And, of course, the cases that I have to rely on are cases where the defense has accused the state of doing the same thing. But in any event, the Scipio case, that's SCIPIO 928 Southern 2nd 1138 from the Supreme Court of Florida, it's going to be on page 9 of the court's copy. I guess begins on page 8. But there they discuss the sort of things that could have been done, procedurally speaking. In this scenario, if the defense attorney had known about the recantation or the change in testimony, the defense could have sought a continuance since the medical investigator's testimony was critical to the defense's case, or the defense could have chosen not to call the witness to avoid the surprise. It is even possible the defense would have chosen to call and impeach the witness to present the jury with his prior inconsistent testimony, although that would appear to have been highly unlikely. What is certain is that the misconduct directly prevented the defense from considering these options and instead forced the defense. Again, so there would be one of a number of things. For example, had this information been communicated, we could have more thoroughly investigated the background and the reasons for the witness doing that, as opposed to having to try to do it rather tactfully in front of the jury. In other words, who suggested that you do it? What did you do? When did you listen to it? What did you listen to it on? Who else was around? When did you communicate this? Why did you do it? And those sorts of things that are very uncomfortable sorts of questions to be confronting a witness in court. Number two, the foundation for his background could have been more fully explored. Number three, it may have been a scenario where we would have said, Judge, we need additional time to, again, investigate the issue of whether he'd been in court or whether he had watched any of the proceedings to know whether or not this is something he should do. The reason, in other words, for his decision that he claimed was on his own. And then finally, Your Honor, there would have been simply the opportunity to point out that apparently this witness did, for whatever his purpose had been, something that he knew was designed deliberately to go ahead and assist the defense. And he communicated this change in his testimony not to anyone other than counsel for Mr. Zimmerman. So there would have been any number of possible procedural avenues the state could have taken, at least at a minimum, to postpone the questioning that had to take place in front of the jury until that issue could be more fully explored in a deposition setting. That is, after all, the reason we take depositions in the first place and the reason questions like that get asked.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Yes, Your Honor.
If he never listened to the tape on Saturday, and he came in here to testify, and the tape was played for him the first time here in court, and he indicated that he knew that that was Mr. Zimmerman's, what would be the difference?
The difference would be that that is I think, a very risky scenario for any to do. But I guess the other reason, the other difference is...
Well, that would have been a risky scenario for the defense.
Yes.
And he wouldn't be changing his testimony. It would just be now he's being played the tape, whereas at his deposition in May, he said he had not listened to the tape. So if he's played the tape the first time in the courtroom...
If he's played the tape the first time in the courtroom, he can then be confronted about, again, the foundation.
Well, I guess my question is going to be, what is the state... if that were to happen, what would the state have done differently? So I understand that you say that his background, but that's something the state could have explored, and his background isn't an issue. It has nothing to do with his identification. Well, the state's being able to explore his background has nothing to do with whether or not he listened to the tape. I don't have the full deposition in me and in front of me, and I don't know whether his background questions were asked. So really, what the issue is, the fact that he now listened to the tape, he identified Mr. Zimmerman's voice as the person on the tape, and the defense knew that Saturday afternoon. What would the state have done differently?
I guess that is somewhat addressed in the next case that I gave, Your Honor, and that's Evans. When we're talking about the scenario that we're talking about here, and I'm sorry, that also in Casika, that's C-A-S-I-K-A, which is the third case. In the Evans case, the court made clear that in situations like this, what really is it's tantamount to never listing the witness at all when you've got such a radical change in opinion. And because of that, the question becomes whether there was a material hindrance to the preparation or strategy of the approaching the witness. I understand the court's question is exactly what that would have been. And the Casika case sort of goes into this. An analysis of the procedural prejudice considers how the defense might have responded had it known about the undisclosed piece of evidence and contemplates the possibility that the defense could have acted to counter the harmful effects of the discovery violation. It is immaterial whether the discovery violation would have made a difference to the fact finder in arriving at the verdict. So because there are a number of different approaches and certainly a number of different ways to react to present that information to the jury, the state was procedurally prejudiced by having it, if it were done, as Your Honor points out, sort of in open court like that, then the opportunity becomes present for the state to say, wait a minute, you're telling us that you've never heard this before, but you can walk in right away and instantly know that, having never, again, heard this person under those sort of circumstances before. Whereas when one side knows exactly what that witness is going to say, it becomes far more easy to ask those questions. If the other side doesn't know what the witness is going to say about it, and doesn't know because that information was deliberately withheld, it hampers the ability to artfully frame that sort of cross-examination. That's the procedural prejudice that the Supreme Court and the appellate courts have recognized before, and that is the prejudice that I'm attempting to articulate now.
Okay, thank you. Mr.
First of
O'Meara?
all, Your Honor, it has to be material, and I'm not certain that an addition of testimony that wasn't apparent and existing at the time of the deposition and was found out later is, in fact, material to begin with.
Are you saying that his identification of Mr. Zimmerman's voice on the tape is not material?
No, it definitely is material. It's material evidence for the jury to consider. But what I'm saying is they had an opportunity to have him play him the tape back in his deposition. They asked him if he had. They could easily have done it back then, and for whatever tactical reason, knowing them to be good prosecutors, they decided not to ask him of that. And quite honestly, nor did I. However, under Scipio and other cases, you have to look at the effect that it has. So if, in fact, I had called them up at 5 or 6 o'clock on Saturday and said, by the way, just heard from a witness, here it is, what would they have done different? That's really their prejudice. I think you were trying to get to it from the opposite side of the timeline. What if he just did it right here? What's your prejudice? So if the state says, if we had known Saturday night, we would have done all this enormous amount of work, let them present that to you to see if that's true and indeed prejudice. I find it almost incredible that we're here on the fact that a witness listened to a tape a couple of days ago and now testified to it in the light of the discovery violations that we've addressed or failed to address in this court for the past year, not the least of which is the Steve Brenton pending discovery violation that leads us to our next motion, which is going to be attempting to figure out how to deal with.
Let's stick on this motion,
Okay,
please.
as to this motion, I think the state has failed to show any prejudice in the fact that Mr. Donnelly took it upon himself, and as is now under oath, did not do it at request of counsel, listened to the tape, and melded that into his testimony. And if, in fact, the state needs, if they lost 36 hours of effort and they want another 36 hours, then maybe they can address it back with the court on Wednesday if there's something that they accomplished then that they couldn't accomplish now. I thought their cross-examination, Mr. Donnelly, was quite good and got to the point of why he listened to it, when he listened to it, and quite honestly did everything else that they would have done had they had the additional 36 hours. I guess 6 or 8 of which we were in deposition, so now we're down to 30, take away sleeping, and maybe there was 20 hours or so they could have done work on Mr. Donnelly. But if they need that time, I think you can give them that. Let's not forget that under Richardson, the courts are obligated to utilize the least restrictive means, if you will, to address any Richardson violation. It's got to be a substantive violation, it's got to be material, and then the remedy is the least amount of remedy which is necessary to address the issue. Certainly, striking a witness's testimony would be the last thing at the far end of the spectrum, and you start at the beginning end of the spectrum, not start at the end.
Respectfully, Your Honor, there are 2 types of violations, willful and inadvertent. When there is a willful violation over and above the least restrictive remedy, the court has the power to penalize that willful violation. I haven't heard that it's anything but that yet. The other matter is, in terms of having more time to prepare, the question isn't, do we need more time now? The question would have been, this is a matter that would have been, reopen the deposition, ask these questions, get this background, instead of having to do it on the fly with the jury sitting there and the court here and trying to proceed in trial with that going on. The time and place and manner to explore all that background and do that is not necessarily in front of the jury because, frankly, it does tend to, if the witness is a sympathetic civilian, create a perception problem. And that's the reason that the defense takes their depositions when they do. It's the reason the state takes their depositions when they do. You don't want to create that impression to the jury that you're somehow attacking or accusing when you don't know the answer to the question. So you have to be much more reluctant. You have to ask questions differently and different questions. That's what had to happen here today. It didn't have to happen here today.
Okay, I misspoke when I said I didn't have the deposition because counsel had given it to me and I found it here on the desk. So I have the transcript here in front of me, and I've been reviewing it, and nowhere in here does anybody ask him what his prior military experience was, and it was the state taking the deposition. So you're coming into court now and saying we didn't have that opportunity. You did have the opportunity at the time of his deposition to ask about his background and go into that. And you may not have known that it was relevant to what his testimony would be today, but the court wanted to correct itself that had not been done. I do find that the defense should have and did not provide that information to the state, but I also find that the state has not shown this court the prejudice that's necessary in order to strike the testimony. So that's the court's ruling on the Richardson hearing. Now we have the toxicology, the animation, and Mr. Root. Which one do you want to go for next? Is the state ready to do that one? Or? Does anybody have a copy of the toxicology report so I can look at it?
I have it on my laptop.
The toxicology consists solely of the lab work that was done that finds 1.5 nanograms per milliliter of active THC in Mr. Martin's blood, and I think it was 7.2 nanograms per milliliter of the metabolite. That's the hard evidence of the use of marijuana that's at issue. We have that provided to the court, but that's all the toxicology revealed that's at issue at this time.
I would like to see a copy if somebody has it. Okay, thank you. Yes, please, thank you. No, I just wanted to be able to look at it while we're having the argument.
Relevant part, I think, Your Honor, is in the box. It's in the box.
Okay, thank you. First page?
Yes, on top. There's a box in the center of it that has the results.
Okay, yeah. This is the state's motion in limine, so who's going to be arguing for the state?
Your Honor, I'll handle it for the state.
Okay, are you ready to proceed?
Judge, I am. As we previously handled this before trial, and I cited for the court the case of Edwards and Arias, and I would rely on those again. Because the defendant did not know Trayvon Martin and did not have any idea about his state and the fact that the levels of marijuana discovered at the autopsy were so minimal, we feel like it is unduly prejudicial for the defense to now try to bring that in, as in without any showing that it would have had an impact and what the impact would have been on Trayvon Martin, and also, of course, that the defendant had no knowledge of it. So therefore, we submit to the court that its probative value is near zero and its prejudicial value is very great. So we would ask you to remain with your opinion in ruling that it should be excluded.
Okay, just so the record is clear as to where the state, where we are on that issue, the pre-trial motion in limine that was heard by the court, I made a ruling that the toxicology report and the results would not be mentioned by either side in the opening statement, and the court reserved as to the admissibility of that report or a testimony regarding it to the time of trial. So that's where we are. Okay, who's arguing on behalf of the defense?
Your Honor, in the motion in limine that was filed, that the court address just this moment regarding opening statements. The focus of the argument was based upon the Diaz case and then ultimately the Arias case, and that is that simply to ask a medical examiner on cross-examination if there was toxicology related to the deceased blood would not in and of itself be admissible. There had to be an issue in the case to which it related, specifically self-defense. We are clearly at the point in this case where self-defense is the issue. It's indeed the focus of the entire case. We know that there is a positive level for THC in Mr. Martin's system. We know that even under Dr. Bowles' testimony, that while he may have at one point said it would have no effect, he changed his testimony. That was the subject of a proffer yesterday, or last Friday, I guess, and then the subject of his notes that the court looked at. That now his testimony would be that yes, there was sufficient THC in Mr. Martin's system, that it would have some effect, maybe somewhat difficult to quantify, but that it would have some effect on his thinking. We know from George Zimmerman's non-emergency call that he said Trayvon Martin, the person he didn't know that he later found out was who he was describing, looks like he's on drugs or something. We also know from looking at the 7-Eleven video that Mr. Martin is swaying at the counter, which I think is consistent with what Mr. Zimmerman later saw. We also know from the evidence that Mr. Martin is carrying a lighter. We know as well that I'll proffer that we have testimony that we'll offer through our expert witness that the level of THC in Mr. Martin's system is sufficient to cause some level of impairment. And that because of that, and because of Mr. Zimmerman's observations of Mr. Martin's behavior, the fact that Mr. Martin indeed was under the influence of drugs at the time is highly relevant and probative for the jury. And I think under the holdings of both Diaz and Arias, it absolutely is admissible, that it supports our claim of self-defense, that now, because Mr. Martin's behavior is also at issue, because self-defense has been raised, that the evidence of his level of toxicology and the testimony as to how that may have impacted on his behavior is highly probative for the jury. We also know, in addition to that, of course, that the state in its motion originally said that there's no evidence to suggest that Mr. Martin ingested the marijuana at or even near the time of death. We know that's not quite right either, because Dr. Bao suggested that he would have ingested it relatively recently without putting a particular time frame on it. We know from Dr. Goldberger's deposition, that's the state's toxicologist, that the ingestion would have been fairly recent. He couldn't say if it was 2 hours or 4 hours, but if he were an occasional user, it would have been within the last few hours prior to his contact with George Zimmerman. In fact, Dr. Goldberger cited to the research of Dr. Marilyn Eustace that we talked about originally in our response to the state's motion. I can take a look, if the court doesn't have a copy of Arias handy, I'm happy to provide a copy of it. But the language in Arias, which references Diaz, is compelling and exactly on point for why this evidence is now admissible, even though it may not have been until the subject of self-defense was raised. May I provide a copy, or does the court?
Please. No, I don't have a copy of that case. Thank you. Did you, State have a copy?
Is that Arias?
Yes.
I do.
Thank you.
The language, it's not a long case anyway, but the legal discussion is head note 2, the numbered paragraph 2. I will read that a homicide defendant is afforded wide latitude in the introduction of evidence supporting his self-defense theory. Where there is even the slightest evidence of an overt act by the victim, which may be reasonably regarded as placing the accused apparently in imminent danger of losing his life or sustaining great bodily harm, all doubts as to the admissibility of evidence bearing on his theory of self-defense must be resolved in favor of the accused. The toxicology evidence comes in because it is relevant evidence and not under any theory of admissibility of character evidence, referring to 90.404. Again, Arias cites to Diaz, which talks about the precise objection the state made in its earlier motion, but we're well past that now.
Okay. I've read it.
I have a copy of Diaz as well.
I have Diaz. Any response?
Please. Judge, again, it's not just that there is a substance present, there has to be an effect, and it can't just be some effect or there may be an effect. There needs to be some concrete testimony or evidence about the exact level and what that impact would have on this person, in this case, Trayvon Martin. We don't have that in this case. In the Arias case, and I believe it's Arias, in that case, it was admitted because there was a .21 blood alcohol level, traces of cocaine, and cocaine metabolites. That's obviously something where a person, an expert, can testify as to the effects that the amount of those substances would have on a person. In this case, we just don't know. We don't know if it brought him up, brought him down, affected his behavior in any way. And as to the defendant's comment that he must be on drugs or he may be on drugs, he also said a lot of other things about Trayvon Martin that weren't true. So I don't know that we can take the defendant's observation. If the court needs to see the 7-Eleven video again, I'd ask the court to review it. The defense says they're swaying. I submit to the court he went in there without any trouble, paid for his drink and candy, and left without any incident. So again, I think they're trying to backdoor some very negative character evidence on a fact that there's a presence of a substance in a system that no one has come before this court and told us what the impact would be and how that would have affected his ability to be either more aggressive or less aggressive or better able to defend himself or not as capable of defending himself. So just to have it out there in front of the jury without some sort of testimony about the effect that it would have had is of no value.
Well, I think that's what they're trying to do through their expert that they're going to come in and testify is to not only the levels in the toxicology report, but what effect that would have.
I understand that's what he said, but I haven't heard that. And I think the court would need to hear that in a proffer before you could make a sound decision on whether or not the probative value outweighs the prejudicial effect.
No, and of course, the state would have the opportunity to cross-examine the witness and to call any rebuttal witnesses if they choose to do so. So when are you expecting the witness to come in and testify?
Likely at some point tomorrow.
Okay, so we'd have an opportunity to proffer that portion of his testimony without going into all the background so I can hear what, because my reading of the Arias case, and there's another case of McBean, that's spelled MC capital B-E-A-N, and that's at 688 Southern 2nd, 383. It's a 1997 case from the 4th DCA. Really stands for the same thing that Arias does, that to not allow that testimony to come in would be reversible error. And that was also a homicide case. And they proffered testimonies to the effects of cocaine ingestion on the behavior of the decedent, and stated ordinarily a toxicologist is not competent to testify on the behavioral effects of cocaine ingestion, but they found that the trial court erred in finding that this toxicologist was not qualified to testify and basically keeping that testimony out. So I don't even know what the proffered testimony would be that would change the rulings in these cases. And like I said, the state has the opportunity to cross-examine this witness, and will also have the opportunity to call rebuttal witness if they so choose. So I'm going to deny the motion in limine and allow the testimony. If there's an objection during the course of the testimony, I'll rule upon the objection at that time.
So the court is not going to conduct a proffer?
I don't, I'm taking what the counsel is saying. The proffer would only be as to what his opinion is the effects of these amounts of THC in a person's blood, what effect that would have, for whatever it's worth. Next two we have are the state's motion in limine regarding Mr. Root and the animation. Do you want to do the one regarding Mr. Root first? I've read the motion, and basically I know what the state's argument is going to be, and I have to, I have to say ask what the defense would offer. That this court's already made a similar ruling, and that was in not allowing the detectives in the case to offer their opinion as to what happened during these events, that was improper. What would be the difference with Mr. Root?
First, I think what the court did sort of in a global sense was not allow law enforcement to come in and say, I don't believe that probable cause existed for the
Right.
arrest.
And the motion in limine, and you can correct if I'm under the wrong assumption, but in the motion in limine filed by the state, it indicates that Mr. Root is a former law enforcement officer, and he's basically an expert witness in law enforcement, and that he's going to testify that the defendant did not violate any Florida rules or statutes, that he acted in self-defense. I mean, if that's where you... Basically, is that what you're asking him to come in and testify to? As to his opinion as to what happened during an incident that he was not there to witness?
There are a couple of categories of testimony I would elicit from him.
Okay.
That one that you just mentioned may be the most problematic for the court, but there are other testimonies, which is his view of force events and how you look at reasonable abilities or relative abilities of the two parties, and how that is one element to consider, and his expertise both from a use of force perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, from a training perspective. So that's another issue that he'd be looking at. He would also be looking at the effects of trauma on a person. He's, of course, been involved in a number of police shootings and has had a lot of both experience with police shootings and the effects on police and some of the safeguards and procedures that are put in place with police officer shootings, the effect that has on the shooter, the effect that trauma has on an individual who suffers it, and how that might affect their ability to testify and remember events. So there are a number of areas in which Mr. Root has a great deal of both experiential and training experience and testifying experience, though not an enormous amount because he's new off of the active law enforcement ranks. But it is in some of those areas that I intend to have him. He's viewed all of the evidence, literally all of the evidence, so he has a good background factually as to what happened. Relied much more on other witnesses' statements of what they perceived, what they saw, of course, medical records, reviewed my client's statements that are now part of the evidence, spent very little time and virtually no substantive time with my client regarding the event, so that all of his testimony would be only on the evidence which is now before the jury, and would be able to sort of present to the jury in an expert perspective information that he is personally or professionally aware of from an expert perspective, which may assist the jury. Just as we bring in any other expert, we can make believe that.
Aren't those common sense issues for the jury to make a determination on their own?
No, I don't believe that this jury has much of an idea as to how a law enforcement officer and any other person reacts to a traumatic event. That traumatic event being getting beat up and having to shoot somebody. I don't think that this jury has the experience background to talk about what relative physical abilities are, which is one thing that they are required to consider under the jury instructions. And just as we could say that the jury could consider what it's like to be under 1.5 nanograms of pot, the state is suggesting that we not allow them to make such an assumption, that we bring forth expert evidence before we bring this evidence before the jury. In like ways, we have an expert who can tell this jury about the effects of an event on a person's ability to remember, to recount, and to discuss properly. And while, again, it may be somewhat problematic to have him come in and testify that based upon his review of all the entirety of the circumstances, that Mr. Zimmerman acted reasonably in reasonable fear of great bodily injury. If the court were to limit that, I would understand. But there are a great deal of his information, most of his information that he can impart to the jury would not be talking about ultimate fact issues. And let's not forget that ultimate fact issues are not per se improper. It's just that you can't invade the province of a jury while doing so.
Okay, thank you. Who's arguing? Mr. Guy?
Thank you, Judge. Judge, the motion in limine is relatively narrowly tailored to the three opinions that he offered in his deposition. I think I deposed him for 2.5 hours a week ago Saturday, and this is what he said his three opinions were. Those are not proper for a jury, as the court has already noted based on the case law cited in the motion. As to his other facts or opinions, I suppose we will make objections at the time as to their relevance, understanding that he may understand how law enforcement officers or other people might react to a situation, but I don't know how he's going to testify how this defendant reacted, not having been there and not having known the defendant prior to the murder of Trayvon Martin. So as to the other elements of his testimony mentioned by defense counsel, I'll make objections at the right time. But again, the limine motion is relatively narrowly tailored to the three opinions offered in his deposition. I ask the court to grant that, as all of them speak directly to his the defendant's guilt or innocence, and therefore would be improper.
Okay, any response?
Just that I would proffer to the court, because I think it's going to be necessary for the court to review it before making determination. We do have a copy of the transcript of his deposition. It did run 2.5 hours or so, but it outlines not only his opinions in well-formatted categories so that you could see my argument, even if it's not as artful as it was presented in a 2.5-hour deposition, and also gives a good foundation so that as you're determining whether or not to allow it, you can sort of see the basis for his foundation, both from an evidentiary standpoint and from his experience standpoint. So I guess I'm asking you to take the time maybe tonight to review the deposition before making a decision on that, because it might assist you in crafting whatever order you might have.
Okay. Thank you. I don't need to read it for that purpose. The state's motion is very clear as to specific opinions that he may have. And the court finds that allowing Mr. Root to testify as an expert would be bolstering the credibility of the defendant from his statements, which is improper, and it would also introduce self-serving statements which are otherwise an admissible hearsay. And that would be the state's motion in limine is granted that Mr. Root cannot testify that the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, was reasonable in his use of deadly force against Trayvon Martin. Second, the defendant did not violate any Florida statutes in his use of force against Trayvon Martin. And third, that the defendant exhibited restraint before using deadly force against Trayvon Martin. Those are the areas in which he will not be allowed to testify. That leaves us with the animation.
sure that we're arguing now the same point, because in response, I don't want to steal your thunder, in response to objections that we've gone back and forth, the animation has now been limited in great fashion. I'm not sure we could call it an animation anymore, but I guess there is some moving parts to it before it goes to still frames. So
Well, let me ask you a question. Is this being sought to be introduced as an exhibit or for use as a demonstrative,
as an exhibit, Your Honor?
and to be introduced into evidence?
Yes.
Okay, well then do we have to have a Daubert hearing?
I probably.
Well, call your first witness.
Now, I think the newest version of the animation was given to me about 3 hours ago. It is significantly different than the last version, but I still maintain some of the objections.
I'm wondering, Your Honor,
This was noticed for hearing for this evening, so I'm ready to go.
okay, I'm not certain that I am right now, but I'm wondering if maybe even with a 5 or 10 minute break, I just want to be able to focus the state's objections, because we've attempted to address some of them by limiting the animation nature of the exhibit. So I'm just,
Okay, well, if it's an animation for demonstrative purposes, then Daubert would not apply. But if it's being sought to be introduced into evidence, I think that there it requires a Daubert hearing. If it were before July 1st, it would have been a Fry hearing, but now that's changed. So we will take a recess for 15 minutes to give you an opportunity to discuss with the state if there's still objections to it. Before we do that, could council approach for 1 moment? Please be seated. Where are we on the animation issue?
there are still some objections. We are waiting on a Daubert witness who is maybe 10 or 15 minutes away from the courthouse. That is, of course, Mr. Shoemaker, who both created the animation, has testified about it in the past. So if we can wait, we can do it now. I think it's going to be better for us to wait, but I mean, it's,
Has the state seen the new version?
yes.
Okay. And what are your objections at this point in time?
As outlined in the supplemental motion, Your Honor, where I kind of itemized several of them.
Well, some of them were resolved. or
Really,
they-
portions of one of them have been resolved. Most of the rest of them remain. As it relates specifically to D, the portion of D that indicates that the number of blows being depicted, the angles and reactions to those blows, the behavior of the figure representing the victim after the fatal gunshot was inflicted by the defendant, those have been removed. So those do not longer apply. However, the remainder of D is unaddressed. Also, as I informed Mr. O'Mara, it's difficult to tell based on objection J, what the change in version 3 from version 2 really was based on. Is it, in other words, is it based on the idea that now we are only sticking to certain testimony, whereas in deposition he testified that it was written statements, police reports, the defendant's video walkthrough, location of the shell casing, and also in-court testimony, which prompted the change from 1 to 2? Or have we now gone all the way and only using in-court testimony? I don't know. I simply don't know the nature or the basis for the change. So,
Would it be helpful to the state to talk to Mr. Shoemaker when he gets here before we go into the time for a hearing? And maybe those questions will be answered, and then we can limit the scope of things?
certainly, I'm happy to do that, Your Honor.
Okay.
I think that makes perfect sense. The question is just keeping the court here until he gets here and we do that. The only alternative would be to take this up in the morning.
I'd rather do it now.
Okay.
Okay, so what we'll do is I'll be in recess until Mr. Shoemaker gets here, and at that time, if the state and the defense will meet with Mr. Shoemaker to see if you've resolved some of your questions, and then let me know by letting the deputies know when you're ready.
Mr. Godwin,
Housekeeping matter, Your Honor. States 193 was a timeline of calls,
Right.
and we made some handwritten changes to it. We have since reprinted it so it doesn't look like handwriting and looks more professional. With the court's permission, and I think the defense has agreed that they are identical now, we would ask to substitute the pre-printed for the 193, the handwritten copy.
Any objections from the defense?
No.
Okay, if you want to just take the sticker off or put a new sticker on, and
We don't want it marked as either redacted and unredacted.
because it's not redacted, it's just, it has the same information, but it's just typed differently.
So if we can just put a 193 on this one.
There is something different.
What's that? Right.
RTL.
Right, that's what we've,
It was handwritten as it's supposed to be printed, so if you want to create a new sticker or take that sticker off, is fine.
Okay.
thank you, Judge.
So the court will be in recess until I'm told you're ready.
You have an issue about additional notice on the weather. Have you had a chance to review them?
Maybe you can review that while we're in recess. Thank you.
Evening, Your Honor.
Okay. Did y'all have an opportunity to talk?
We have talked about it. There are still concerns I think the court's going to need to resolve.
Okay.
We haven't met Daniel Shoemaker yet, and Shoemaker, Joseph Nelson.
Hello, good afternoon.
I believe that we need to have an admissibility hearing. I know the state has some objections. I guess we can identify those, and then we'll just go forward with Mr. Shoemaker.
Even before we get to that point, Judge, part of the motion did contain a request for a Richardson hearing as it relates to the timeliness of the disclosure. And as I said, the current version of this animation was provided to me approximately 1:30, 1:45 today here in the courtroom. In addition to which, just during our consultation, I found out that the reason for the new version, which I think pages 33 and 34 of his deposition, we discussed that there weren't going to be any more, is that a couple days ago, this witness spoke to another defense expert witness and changed the animation based upon that consultation, neither of which was disclosed either by counsel or I think the other witness was deposed within the last few days as well. He didn't bother to mention that either. Mr. Shoemaker, I think his deposition was completed significantly in advance of whatever meeting they had, so I wouldn't have expected him to mention it other than, as I say, on pages 33 and 34 of his deposition, we anticipated that there would be no more of this. So I guess before we even proceed to the admissibility hearing further, I'm in the same position I was before with, again, having new information about the source of all this stuff and not having had the chance to adequately and fully explore that.
Okay, and what is it that you're requesting the court do?
As far as this goes,
You have to have some kind of a...
I do, and my request would be, again, since I'm now having to re-explore this again with a new video, I'm going to ask again for the opportunity to more fully develop that issue by continuing again the deposition of Mr. Shoemaker. And I also believe that based upon this information, the deposition of Dr. DeMaio will need to be reopened so that that issue can be addressed as well with him, because it wasn't. And so that is what I'm asking the court. I suppose I don't mind so much if the court wants to proceed at least on the foundational questions of admissibility for Daubert purposes here. Candidly, I'm assuming that for most of those criteria, the defendant will be able to meet them following this hearing. So I don't object to participating with that. However, as it relates to the addressing of the specific objections, again, I'm going to want a little more opportunity with this witness to flesh those out.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Manti, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you really don't think that this is a Daubert issue, and it's more for the court to address your objections to certain aspects of this animation.
As I understand it, while I agree with the court that it is a Daubert issue, I believe, just based upon my knowledge of the witness's CV, my knowledge of the software that's used, and the deposition that's been taken so far, I believe that they will be able to satisfy the court as to the Daubert standard. So my primary objection is not to going forward on that so that we can get that out of the way and it can be of record. However, my issue is what we do beyond that. Once we've satisfied that it might be admissible for Daubert purposes, or a whole other reasons that the objections by the state that are filed here are not based upon Daubert. They're based upon other things.
Well, I was trying to make a determination if we were going to go forward with a Daubert hearing, if the state is satisfied that this animation, once the admissibility is determined in concert with your objections, then why do we need to go through and take all the testimony?
I agree with the court, and that's the reason in the objections I did not ask for a Daubert hearing. I think the case law is fairly clear that this sort of thing is going to be, and I believe the witness can testify and would satisfy the court. So I am not asking for a Daubert hearing.
Right.
But I understand why the court wanted one, and I was happy to proceed with that.
Well, I only wanted one if that was what the state was seeking, but now the state is not seeking a Daubert determination by the court, and I don't need to go forward with that part of it, but I can take, under the case, the Pierce case, there's a certain hearing that has to be held that determines whether or not this is admissible, and I'm prepared to go forward with that if you are.
Well, and that was, again, why I brought up to the court that we are now on yet another new version of the software based upon yet another conversation that wasn't covered in the deposition and has actually occurred subsequent to the deposition, and nobody told us.
So what would you like to do about that? Do you want the court to go forward with the hearing under the Pierce case, or do you want to have an opportunity to talk to Mr. Shoemaker about what your concerns are and address this in the morning? What is it that you're asking? You said you needed more time. I'm just trying to figure out.
I would like to reopen his deposition, not just talk to him, because I have talked to him, and based upon my conversation with him, I now have additional concerns.
He's here now.
Yes.
Do you want to take his deposition now?
I would be happy to do that, Judge.
Any objections to that? And then we'll continue this hearing at 8:30 in the morning?
That's fine. Do you want any clarity as to the points of concern, or just let it proceed, they open them up in a deposition?
Give him the opportunity to open it up in deposition, because it may not be an issue in the morning.
Okay.
Or it may pare down the issues that have to be determined in the morning.
Okay.
Mr.
So-
Manti said he needs to explore that issue more with Mr. Shoemaker, and he would prefer to do that by deposition, and I will afford him the opportunity to do so, especially in light of the fact that Mr. Shoemaker is here and available at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor. And again, I just got it at 1:30 today and just found out about this subsequent conversation half an hour ago.
So any objections to the court recessing for the evening, allowing the deposition to be continued of Mr. Shoemaker this evening, and being back in court at 8:30 in the morning?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Yeah. We had another proffer at 8:30, so we'll just line them up. And you may want to deal with the jury, because we're going to need, I'm not sure the extent of the non-Daubert hearing we're going to have. The Pierce hearing, I think, is going to be also pretty easy to accomplish. I know that the state's concerns are, you have this happening, it may not be that, but that's not, I think, that's just weight, not admissibility, I think. But we can get to that, and then right after we finish with that part of it, we'll need to talk to or deal with the other proffer, which I think is going to take another 45 minutes or so for that. So I'm just thinking the jury's not, we're going to get to see the jury till.
Is that witness supposed to be testifying tomorrow? The other proffer? Can we have that proffer hearing tomorrow after court?
He's not looking at me, look at me.
Subject only, of course, to how quickly things go tomorrow. We can't really predict when all of the witnesses we have planned will finish. certainly at the point that we have no other witnesses, we could take on that proffer and then immediately follow that with his testimony.
All right, why don't we do a wait and see in that, and we'll do this hearing tomorrow morning at 8:30. The other proffer will be
Whenever we can.
prior to the testimony. Is that acceptable to both sides?
Yes, Your Honor.
What witness are we talking about the second?
That would be
Dr.
Connor,
DeMaio?
Richard Connor, regarding the proffers of that
I
information.
apologize for interjecting, but I know that Dr. DeMaio, based on what we've just found out, I may need to redepose him as to that limited thing again if he's providing additional information or additional opinions that I was not aware of in the deposition that we took Saturday. So I just want to have an opportunity to depose, if necessary, Dr. DeMaio based on what we have just found out half an hour ago that occurred. Apparently, Dr. DeMaio at some point spoke to this witness, Mr. Schumacher, I believe it is. And I took his deposition Saturday, never mentioned that, so I'd like to have an opportunity to fully explore that, and I apologize, but I took his deposition
Can you
Saturday.
do that over the phone first, and then if there's a need to actually take a deposition, then you can be given the
I spoke to
opportunity?
Mr. West, and I believe Dr. DeMaio's en route, so we're gonna try to do that, but
And just to clear up the issues so we know what we're talking about with Dr. DeMaio and the interaction of the two, the question is the angle of the gunshot. Dr. Bao testified as 90 degrees. Dr. DeMaio confirmed that it's 90 degrees, and then there were conversations about the distance between the skin and the clothing, which, as they took in deposition, was 2 to 4 inches. It was that very specific and quite limited fact that was communicated from Dr. DeMaio to Mr. Shoemaker. In this animation, that only shows up as how Mr. Shoemaker has Trayvon Martin over. We know, and it'll never be determined, that the shot is 90 degrees, but we don't know the exact angle of Trayvon Martin's body or of George Zimmerman's arm, but we know that. It is looking like that. That's something that goes to weight to the jury. That's the only issue that was discussed between the two. I will tell you that there was the only other information was Dr. DeMaio's knowledge of gunshot being that 2 by 2 inch stippling pattern suggests that the clothing was about 2 to 4 inches away. So we're not talking about a really precise, a detailed re-examination. What I just told you was the fact that they need to
All
talk
right.
about
Well,
that.
since you're taking Mr. Shoemaker's, continuing his deposition today, you can ask him about what information he got from Dr. DeMaio, and then you can call Dr. DeMaio on the phone and see if you need to further take his deposition, and we'll address that issue if need be.
thank you.
Thank you, Your
All
Honor.
right. Is there anything else that we need to take up before the court recesses for today?
No, thanks, Your Honor. We have a couple of matters pending we'll deal with tomorrow.
Well, if council will approach, I have that one question to ask you. Court is in recess. Mr. Shoemaker, if you'll please stay for your deposition until 8:30 in the morning.